I don't care if your computer says he belongs in first class. I specifically paid $12,000 to avoid sitting next to people like that, and I expect you to honor my investment." The words sliced through the hushed luxury of the Boeing 777's first-class cabin, like a blade through silk spoken by Bradford Wellington III, with the casual certainty of a man who had never been told no in his 52 years of existence. He stood in the narrow aisle between seats 1A and 1B, his platinum blonde hair perfectly styled despite the early morning hour, his bespoke navy suit tailored to emphasize the broad shoulders that 4 decades of tennis at exclusive country clubs had maintained. The gold Rolex Submariner on his wrist caught the overhead cabin lighting as he gestured dismissively toward the boarding pass being held by a tall, dignified black man who had committed the apparent crime of attempting to occupy the window seat that Bradford's money couldn't quite buy outright. Bradford Wellington III, Brad to his equally wealthy friends, Mr. Wellington to everyone else, had built his fortune on the simple principle that money could solve any problem, silence any objection, and rearrange any inconvenience to his satisfaction. As the managing partner of Wellington Capital Management, he controlled a hedge fund worth $3.2 billion money that gave him the power to destroy companies with a phone call or elevate startups to Fortune 500 status with a signature. His great-grandfather had built the family fortune in steel during the Industrial Revolution. His grandfather had multiplied it through strategic investments during the Depression, and his father had modernized it through technology acquisitions in the 1980s. Bradford was the latest heir to a legacy of winning, and winning meant never having to tolerate discomfort, inconvenience, or the proximity of people he considered beneath his social stratum. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was currently standing in a commercial airline at all rather than reclining in the leather seats of his private Gulfstream G650. But mechanical problems had grounded his jet just 18 hours before the most important meeting of his career. The acquisition of Meridian Medical Technologies, a pioneering cardiac surgery equipment manufacturer based in London, represented the capstone deal that would cement his reputation as one of the most successful fund managers on Wall Street. The company's revolutionary heart valve technology had captured his attention 6 months ago, not because he understood the medical intricacies, but because the financial projections showed profit margins that made his pulse quicken with anticipation. "Sir," the flight attendant was saying, her voice strained with the particular tension that comes from trying to manage an escalating situation while maintaining professional composure. "This gentleman has a valid boarding pass for seat 1B, and we've confirmed the upgrade through our system. Perhaps we could find you another suitable seat in first class, or I could speak with the gate agent about alternative arrangements." Sarah Martinez had been working for the airline for nearly 15 years, long enough to recognize the dangerous combination of wealth entitlement and barely contained rage that radiated from passengers like Bradford Wellington. She had dealt with demanding celebrities, intoxicated diplomats, and mentally unstable frequent flyers. But there was something particularly unsettling about the way this man's blue eyes had gone cold and calculating the moment he'd seen his seatmate. This wasn't just garden-variety rudeness or travel stress. This was something deeper and more poisonous, something that made her instinctively want to call for backup, even though no physical threat had been made. Bradford ignored her suggestion entirely. His attention focused on the tall black man who stood quietly beside him, holding his boarding pass with the patient dignity of someone accustomed to navigating uncomfortable social situations. "I specifically spoke with Linda at your concierge desk yesterday." Bradford continued, his voice rising just enough to catch the attention of nearby passengers without quite crossing into shouting territory. "I explained that I needed a suitable environment for this flight, something appropriate for a passenger of my caliber and status. I was assured that my concerns would be addressed, and yet here we are with what appears to be a complete failure of your customer service protocols." The man beside him, Dr. Elijah Washington, though Bradford had no way of knowing either his name or his profession, simply stood there with the kind of calm that comes from years of facing adversity with grace. His charcoal wool blazer was well made but not ostentatious. His white Oxford shirt was crisp, but showed the slight wrinkles that come from a long day of travel, and his leather satchel bore the comfortable wear marks of a bag that had seen thousands of miles and countless important meetings. Everything about his appearance suggested quiet competence and understated success, but Bradford's eyes saw only what his prejudices allowed him to perceive a threat to his comfort, an intrusion into his carefully curated world of privilege and exclusion. "I believe there's been some kind of misunderstanding," Dr. Washington said softly, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who chose his words carefully and spoke them with intention. "I certainly don't want to cause any disruption to your flight experience, and if there's another seat available that would be more suitable for everyone involved, I'm perfectly happy to discuss alternatives with the crew. My primary concern is simply getting to London in time for my obligations there, and I'm grateful for any accommodation that allows that to happen." The reasonableness of the response seemed to infuriate Bradford even more, as if the other man's refusal to become defensive or argumentative somehow represented a further insult to his authority. He had expected pushback, confrontation, perhaps even anger, emotions that would have justified his own aggressive stance and validated his assumption that he was dealing with someone unsuitable for first-class travel. Instead, he found himself facing a level of dignity and composure that made his own behavior appear petty and unreasonable by comparison, a realization that only served to escalate his frustration. "The only alternative I'm interested in discussing," Bradford said, his voice dropping to the kind of menacing whisper that had intimidated countless business rivals and subordinates over the years, "is the one where you find your way back to wherever passengers like you are supposed to sit, and I'm allowed to enjoy the flight experience that I paid for without having to worry about whether my belongings are safe or whether I'm going to be comfortable sleeping next to someone I don't know and frankly don't trust." The cabin had grown noticeably quieter as other passengers became aware that something unusual was unfolding in the premium section. A young tech entrepreneur in seat 3A had removed his noise-canceling headphones and was watching the interaction with undisguised interest, his phone positioned in a way that suggested he might be recording. An elderly woman in pearls and a Chanel suit had lowered her copy of the Financial Times and was observing the scene with the sharp attention of someone who recognized drama when she saw it. Even the passengers in the rows behind first class were craning their necks to get a better view of whatever was causing the delay in their departure. Sarah felt the weight of 180 pairs of eyes watching her handle a situation that was rapidly spiraling beyond the scope of standard customer service protocols. She had been trained to de-escalate conflicts, accommodate reasonable requests, and maintain the airline's reputation for excellence, but she had never encountered a passenger who was essentially demanding racial segregation on a commercial flight in 2024. The legal implications alone were staggering. Federal aviation regulations explicitly prohibited discrimination based on race, and the incident was clearly being recorded by multiple passengers who would undoubtedly share their footage across social media platforms before the plane even reached cruising altitude. "Mr. Wellington," she said, having checked his name on the passenger manifest, "I need to be very clear that all passengers who hold valid tickets are welcome in any section of the aircraft for which they've been properly assigned or upgraded. Our airline has a strict policy of non-discrimination, and I'm not able to ask any passenger to change seats based on your personal preferences about their appearance or background. If you're experiencing anxiety about flying or have specific medical needs that require particular seating arrangements, I'd be happy to discuss those concerns with you privately." Bradford's face flushed a deeper shade of red as he realized that his usual tactics of intimidation and financial leverage weren't producing the immediate compliance he expected. In his world of exclusive golf clubs, private equity deals, and invitation-only social events, his preferences were treated as commands, and his comfort was prioritized above all other considerations. The idea that a flight attendant, someone he considered service staff, would refuse to accommodate his clearly stated wishes was so foreign to his experience that he struggled to process the rejection. "Let me explain something to you, Sarah," he said, reading her name tag with deliberate condescension. since you apparently don't understand how this industry actually works. I am a Diamond Medallion member with over 2 million miles on this airline. I personally know your Vice President of Operations, and my company spends approximately $400,000 annually on corporate travel through your carrier. When someone with my level of investment in your airline expresses concerns about passenger compatibility and requests reasonable accommodations to ensure a comfortable flight experience, the appropriate response is to find a solution that addresses those concerns, not to lecture me about policies that clearly weren't designed with passengers of my caliber in mind. Dr. Washington shifted slightly, adjusting the strap of his worn leather bag and checking his watch with the subtle impatience of someone who had important obligations waiting for him in London. He had been traveling for nearly 6 hours already, having flown from Detroit to JFK for this connection, and his body was beginning to feel the fatigue that comes from navigating airport security lines and the countless small indignities that modern air travel imposed on everyone, regardless of their station in life. More importantly, he was acutely aware that every minute of delay brought him closer to the possibility of missing his surgical window. A 7-year-old girl named Sophie Chen was waiting for him at Great Ormond Street Hospital, where a complex heart valve repair that only a handful of surgeons in the world could perform successfully was scheduled for the following morning. The weight of that responsibility sat heavily on his shoulders as he listened to Bradford's increasingly agitated demands, but it also provided him with a sense of perspective that made the current conflict seem almost trivial by comparison. He had spent the better part of 2 decades performing surgery on children whose hearts were failing, whose families had exhausted every other option, and who looked to him as their last hope for survival. The idea that his presence in a particular airplane seat could cause such distress to another adult human being was both fascinating from a psychological standpoint and deeply saddening from a human one. Daddy. The voice was small but clear, cutting through the tension like a bell ringing in the distance, and Bradford turned to see a young black girl making her way up the aisle from the coach section. She was perhaps 12 years old, with braided hair decorated with small silver beads that caught the cabin lighting, and she carried herself with the kind of poise that suggested both good upbringing and natural intelligence. Her school uniform, a navy blazer over a white blouse with a plaid skirt, marked her as a student at one of the better private academies, and the slight concern in her dark eyes suggested that she had noticed something was wrong with her father's boarding process. Maya, Dr. Washington said gently, his entire demeanor softening as he saw his daughter approaching. "What are you doing up here? I thought you were getting settled in your seat." "The lady at the gate said you got moved to the fancy seats," Maya replied, looking around the first-class cabin with the kind of wide-eyed curiosity that children display when encountering new experiences. "I wanted to make sure you found it okay, and I wanted to see what the fancy seats look like. They're really big, and they have those little TV screens right in front of you, not like the big ones hanging from the ceiling in coach." Bradford found himself staring at this unexpected addition to the scene, his mind struggling to process the implications of what he was witnessing. The presence of the child complicated his narrative in ways that made him distinctly uncomfortable. It was one thing to object to sharing space with an adult stranger, but quite another to make those objections in front of someone's daughter. The girl's obvious education, her polite manner of speaking, and her clear affection for her father created cognitive dissonance with the assumptions and stereotypes that had been driving his behavior. "Maya, sweetheart." Dr. Washington continued, "I need you to go back to your seat and let the flight attendants finish getting everyone settled. This gentleman and I are just working out some details about seating arrangements, and then we'll be able to get going to London. You remember how excited you were about seeing Big Ben and the Tower of London? Is there a problem with your seat, Daddy?" Maya asked with the direct curiosity of childhood, looking between her father and Bradford with genuine puzzlement. "Did somebody make a mistake with the tickets? Because Mommy always says that mistakes happen sometimes, and the important thing is to be patient while the grown-ups figure out how to fix them." The innocence of the question hung in the air like an accusation, highlighting the absurdity of the entire situation in a way that no adult intervention had managed to achieve. Here was a child clearly well-raised and articulate asking the most basic and reasonable questions about what should have been a simple boarding process, and her very presence illuminated the ugliness of Bradford's position in stark relief. Sarah felt a wave of protectiveness toward the little girl combined with a growing anger at the passenger who was creating this unnecessarily hostile environment in front of a child. "There's no problem with the ticket, sweetheart," Sarah said, kneeling down slightly to bring herself closer to Maya's eye level. "Your daddy has been assigned to a very nice seat, and we're just making sure he has everything he needs to be comfortable during the flight. Sometimes it takes a few extra minutes to get everything sorted out, but we'll have you both on your way to London very soon." Bradford watched this exchange with growing frustration, recognizing that the presence of the child had fundamentally altered the dynamics of the situation in ways that worked against his interests. The optics of his position had become increasingly indefensible. He was essentially a wealthy white man demanding that a black father be separated from the first-class seat he had legitimately been assigned, and he was making these demands in front of the man's well-dressed, articulate daughter. Even in his current state of agitation, Bradford possessed enough social awareness to recognize that this was not a scenario that would reflect well on him if it became public knowledge. But his commitment to his own comfort and his deeply ingrained sense of entitlement proved stronger than his concern for appearances, and he found himself doubling down on his position even as the rational part of his mind urged him to find a graceful way to retreat from the conflict. Doctor Elijah Washington had learned long ago that the world would constantly test his right to occupy the spaces where his talents, achievements, and qualifications had earned him a place, but the lesson had never become easier to bear with repetition. Standing in the aisle of Flight 847's first-class cabin, watching his 12-year-old daughter navigate the awkward tension that surrounded them with the same grace she brought to everything else in her young life, he felt the familiar weight of representing more than just himself in yet another moment where his presence was being questioned and challenged. The journey that had brought him to this moment, both literally and figuratively, stretched back through decades of similar confrontations, each one a small battle in a larger war for dignity and recognition that he had been fighting since childhood. Growing up in Detroit as the son of a single mother who cleaned office buildings at night and took in laundry during the day to pay for his Catholic school education, Elijah had understood from an early age that excellence was not just a personal goal, but a survival strategy. His mother, Diane Washington, had worked 2 and sometimes 3 jobs to ensure that her son had access to the kind of education that could lift him out of the cycle of poverty and limited opportunities that had defined her own life. "You're going to be a doctor, baby," she had told him countless times as they sat together at their kitchen table. Her hands cracked and weathered from harsh cleaning chemicals as she helped him with his homework after her 12-hour shifts. "Not because I say so, but because you're smart enough and strong enough to do anything you set your mind to. But being smart isn't enough in this world. You're going to have to be better than good, better than great, better than they expect any black boy from Detroit to be. And even then, some people are going to try to tell you that you don't belong where your hard work has earned you the right to be." Those words had proven prophetic throughout his educational journey from the predominantly white suburban high school where his academic achievements were often attributed to affirmative action rather than ability through his undergraduate years at Harvard, where he was frequently the only black student in his advanced science courses to medical school at Johns Hopkins, where some of his professors seemed surprised by his consistent performance at the top of his class. Each phase had brought new challenges, new moments where he was forced to prove his worth and defend his presence in spaces where others took their belonging for granted. The transition to his surgical residency had been particularly brutal, with 100-hour work weeks attending physicians who seemed determined to break him, and the constant pressure of knowing that any mistake would be magnified and attributed to his race rather than the normal learning curve that all residents experienced. But it was during those years of exhaustion and grinding pressure that he had discovered his true calling: pediatric cardiac surgery, the most demanding and precise specialty in all of medicine, where the margin for error was measured in millimeters, and the stakes were literally life and death. His first successful surgery as a chief resident had been on a 3-year-old boy whose heart had been damaged by a congenital defect so rare that only a handful of cases had been documented in medical literature. The procedure had taken 11 hours, with Elijah's hands moving through microscopic repairs, while a team of nurses and technicians maintained the delicate balance of machines that kept the child alive. When the boy's heart had finally begun beating with its new improved rhythm, and when his parents had cried tears of relief and gratitude in the recovery room, Elijah had understood that this was what he had been born to do, not just to heal individual patients, but to advance the field of cardiac surgery in ways that would save countless lives for generations to come. The success of that first case had led to others, each one building his reputation as a surgeon who could handle the most complex and challenging procedures with unusual skill and composure. Within 5 years of completing his residency, he had been recruited by several of the most prestigious medical centers in the country, ultimately accepting a position at Detroit Medical Center that allowed him to serve the community where he had grown up, while also conducting research that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in cardiac surgery. It was during those early years of his career that he had met and married Dr. Keisha Williams, a brilliant pediatric anesthesiologist whose calm presence in the operating room complemented his surgical precision perfectly. Their marriage had been a partnership in every sense of the word. Two highly educated professionals who understood the demands of medical careers and supported each other through the long hours, emotional challenges, and constant pressure that came with holding people's lives in their hands on a daily basis. Maya's birth 12 years ago had changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Everything. Because becoming a father had given Elijah a new understanding of love, responsibility, and the fierce protectiveness that comes with wanting to shield your child from every possible harm. Nothing, because his commitment to surgical excellence and his drive to advance medical knowledge had remained as strong as ever. Only now they were motivated not just by personal ambition, but by the desire to create a world where his daughter could pursue her own dreams without facing the barriers that had complicated his own journey. Keisha's death in a car accident 4 years earlier had shattered the comfortable stability of their life together, leaving Elijah to navigate single parenthood while maintaining his surgical practice and research commitments. Maya had been 8 years old when her mother died, old enough to understand the permanence of the loss, but young enough to need the kind of constant attention and emotional support that seemed impossible to provide while maintaining the demanding schedule that cardiac surgery required. The months following Keisha's death had been the most difficult of Elijah's life as he struggled to balance his responsibilities as a father with his obligations to his patients and his research. There had been moments when he had considered stepping back from surgery entirely, perhaps moving into hospital administration or medical education, where the hours would be more predictable and the emotional toll less severe. But Maya herself had ultimately convinced him to continue his surgical career, telling him one evening as they sat together looking through old photo albums that she was proud to have a daddy who saved other children's lives the way he would want someone to save hers if she ever got sick. "Mommy always said you were a hero," Daddy Maya had told him with the matter-of-fact wisdom that children sometimes display in moments of profound clarity. And heroes don't stop being heroes just because things get hard. They keep helping people because that's what heroes do. The words had given him the strength to continue, and over the past 4 years he had managed to create a new kind of balance between his professional obligations and his role as Maya's father. She had become his traveling companion on many of his international consulting trips, homeschooled through an advanced online program that allowed her to maintain her education while experiencing the world in ways that most children never had the opportunity to explore. Their current trip to London was typical of these combined father-daughter adventures. Elijah had been contacted by the cardiac surgery team at Great Ormond Street Hospital about a 7-year-old girl named Sophie Chen, whose complex heart condition required the kind of specialized valve repair that only a handful of surgeons worldwide had the experience to perform successfully. The case was particularly challenging because Sophie's condition was complicated by previous surgical interventions that had left her heart surrounded by scar tissue, making any future procedures extremely delicate and risky. The medical team in London had sent him detailed scans and surgical notes from Sophie's previous operations, and Elijah had spent weeks studying the case, consulting with colleagues, and developing a surgical approach that might give the little girl the best possible chance for a full recovery. The window for the surgery was narrow. Sophie's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and any further delay might make the procedure impossible to perform safely. That urgency was part of what made the current confrontation on the airplane so particularly frustrating for Elijah. Every minute of delay brought them closer to the possibility that he might miss the surgical window entirely, and while he understood that social conflicts like this one were sometimes unavoidable, he also felt the weight of responsibility for Sophie's life pressing down on him with increasing intensity. Maya, sensing her father's growing tension despite his outwardly calm demeanor, moved closer to him and slipped her small hand into his larger one. At 12 years old, she had already accompanied him on enough medical trips to understand that her father's work was often a matter of life and death, and she had developed an unusual maturity about the importance of his surgical commitments. But she was still a child, and the hostile atmosphere that surrounded them was beginning to make her uncomfortable in ways that she didn't fully understand. "Is that man angry at us, Daddy?" she asked quietly, looking up at Bradford with the kind of direct, curious gaze that children use when they encounter adult behavior that doesn't make sense to them. "Did we do something wrong? I thought you said airline people were usually nice and helpful when we travel for your surgeries." The question pierced through the tension in the cabin like a small, sharp blade, highlighting the absurdity of the situation in a way that all of Sarah's professional de-escalation techniques had failed to achieve. Here was a child asking the most basic and reasonable questions about adult behavior that had no reasonable explanation, and her innocent curiosity threw the irrationality of Bradford's position into stark relief. Elijah squeezed his daughter's hand gently, drawing strength from her presence, while also feeling a renewed determination to handle this situation in a way that would demonstrate the kind of grace and dignity that he wanted her to remember and emulate throughout her own life. He had no way of knowing that this moment on Flight 847 would become a defining experience not just for himself and Maya, but for every person who witnessed it, and the millions more who would eventually see the footage that was already being recorded by multiple passengers throughout the cabin. The discovery of the computer glitch that had automatically upgraded Dr. Washington from his original coach seat to 1B had been made by Sarah Martinez during her pre-flight passenger manifest review. But what should have been a routine courtesy upgrade had instead become the catalyst for a confrontation that was about to test every protocol and procedure that the airline industry had developed for managing passenger conflicts. Sarah had been performing these manifest checks for 15 years, and she had seen her share of last-minute seat changes, computer errors, and upgrade assignments, but she had never encountered a situation where a passenger's reaction to a seatmate threatened to derail an entire flight before it had even left the gate. The irony of the situation was not lost on her. Dr. Washington had originally been scheduled to fly coach because his last-minute booking had occurred after all premium seats had been sold, but a platinum-level frequent flyers cancellation just hours before departure had opened up seat 1B, and the airline's automated system had immediately assigned the upgrade to the next passenger on the standby list. It was exactly the kind of customer service gesture that airlines liked to promote in their marketing materials, rewarding passenger loyalty, providing unexpected comfort to travelers, and demonstrating their commitment to passenger satisfaction. But as Sarah watched the tension escalate between Bradford Wellington and Dr. Washington, with 12-year-old Maya now standing between them, asking innocent questions that somehow made the entire situation even more uncomfortable, she realized that she was witnessing something that went far beyond a simple seating dispute. This was a clash between two entirely different worldviews, two vastly different sets of expectations about how society should function, and two fundamentally incompatible definitions of what constituted appropriate behavior in shared public spaces. Bradford's increasing agitation was becoming more apparent with each passing moment, his face flushing a deeper shade of red, as he realized that his usual combination of financial leverage, social status, and thinly veiled threats was not producing the immediate compliance that he had come to expect from service industry employees. His hands were beginning to shake slightly, whether from anger, frustration, or some combination of both, and his voice was taking on the kind of sharp, commanding tone that suggested he was approaching the limits of his patience with what he clearly viewed as an unacceptable challenge to his authority. "Look," Bradford said, his voice rising just enough to carry to the passengers in the rows immediately behind first class. "I don't care about your computer systems, your upgrade policies, or your company's diversity initiatives. I care about the flight experience that I paid for, which includes the right to travel in comfort without having to worry about whether I'm safe, whether my belongings are secure, or whether I'm going to be able to sleep during an overnight flight. I specifically chose this airline because of its reputation for understanding the needs of premium passengers, and I expect that reputation to be honored regardless of whatever glitches your technology might be experiencing." Dr. Washington listened to this escalating monologue with the kind of patient attention that he brought to difficult conversations with the families of his surgical patients, people who were often frightened, confused, and sometimes angry about circumstances beyond their control, and who needed calm, steady reassurance rather than defensive reactions to their emotional outbursts. He had learned during his years of medical practice that the most effective way to de-escalate tense situations was often simply to acknowledge the other person's concerns without necessarily agreeing with their proposed solutions. "I completely understand your desire to have a comfortable flight experience, Doctor," Washington replied, his voice maintaining the same measured cadence that had served him well in countless high-pressure situations over the years. "Long international flights can be exhausting under the best of circumstances, and I certainly wouldn't want to contribute to any additional stress or discomfort for a fellow traveler. Perhaps we could ask the crew if there are alternative arrangements that would address your concerns while still allowing everyone to reach London on schedule." The reasonableness of his response seemed to have the opposite effect on Bradford than what Dr. Washington had intended, almost as if his refusal to become defensive or argumentative was being interpreted as a form of passive-aggressive resistance. Bradford's eyes narrowed as he studied the other man's calm expression, searching for signs of mockery, condescension, or hidden anger that might justify his own increasingly hostile behavior. Maya, meanwhile, had been quietly observing this adult interaction with the kind of intense curiosity that children display when they encounter social dynamics that don't fit their understanding of how people are supposed to treat each other. At 12 years old, she had accompanied her father on enough business trips to understand that air travel often involved delays, complications, and minor inconveniences that required patience and flexibility from everyone involved. But she had never witnessed a situation where one passenger seemed to be objecting to another passenger's mere presence, and the concept was both puzzling and distressing to her developing sense of fairness and justice. "Daddy," she said, tugging gently on Dr. Washington's sleeve to get his attention. "Why doesn't this man want to sit next to you? Are you sick? Did you forget to brush your teeth this morning? Because sometimes when I don't want to sit next to someone, it's because they smell funny or they're coughing a lot. But you don't smell funny and you're not coughing." The innocent directness of the question created a moment of absolute silence in the first-class cabin, as if Maya's words had somehow crystallized the underlying tensions in a way that made them impossible to ignore or rationalize away. Several passengers who had been pretending to read magazines or check their phones while surreptitiously monitoring the confrontation now looked up openly, their attention focused on how the adults in the situation would respond to a child's perfectly reasonable request for an explanation. Bradford felt his face grow even hotter as he realized that Maya's question had essentially forced him to either provide an honest answer about his objections to her father's presence, an answer that would inevitably expose the racial basis of his concerns, or to fabricate some other explanation that might satisfy a 12-year-old's curiosity but would be transparently false to the adults who were listening. Either choice would put him in an untenable position, but the alternative of simply refusing to answer would make him appear cruel and unreasonable in the face of a child's innocent inquiry. "It's not about your father specifically," Bradford set his voice tight with the strain of trying to maintain some semblance of reasonableness while still holding to his position. It's about the principle of passenger compatibility and the importance of creating an environment where everyone can be comfortable during a long flight. Sometimes that means making adjustments to seating arrangements based on various factors that might not be immediately obvious to someone your age. Maya considered this explanation with the kind of serious attention that she brought to her father's explanations of complex medical procedures, but her expression suggested that Bradford's answer had raised more questions than it had resolved. What kind of factors, she asked with the persistence that had made her an excellent student, but sometimes a challenging daughter. Is it because Daddy is taller than average? Because he takes up more room in the seat? Or is it because he sometimes talks to other doctors on his phone during flights when he has important surgery cases to discuss? The specificity of her questions demonstrated not only her intelligence, but also her deep familiarity with her father's travel habits and professional responsibilities, painting a picture of a close father-daughter relationship built on mutual respect and open communication. The contrast between Maya's obvious affection and pride in her father's work and Bradford's inexplicable hostility to Dr. Washington's presence became increasingly difficult for the other passengers to ignore. Sarah Martinez recognized that the situation was rapidly approaching a point where her standard customer service protocols would be insufficient to resolve the conflict, and she began mentally preparing herself to call for backup from the purser and possibly even the captain. In her 15 years of flight attendant experience, she had developed an intuitive sense for when passenger disputes were likely to escalate beyond the point where crew intervention could restore harmony, and everything about Bradford's body language and vocal tone suggested that he was not going to accept any solution that required him to compromise his position. At the same time, she was becoming increasingly impressed by Dr. Washington's handling of what was obviously a deeply uncomfortable and potentially humiliating situation. His refusal to become angry or defensive, his consistent attempts to find common ground and reasonable solutions, and most importantly, his gentle guidance of his daughter through a confusing and upsetting experience demonstrated exactly the kind of character and emotional intelligence that she wished more passengers would display when faced with travel-related stress and inconvenience. "Maya, sweetheart doctor," Washington said, placing a protective hand on his daughter's shoulder. Sometimes adults have disagreements about things that don't really have clear right or wrong answers, and the most important thing is for everyone to be patient and respectful while we work through the situation. This gentleman is concerned about having a comfortable flight, which is completely understandable, and I'm sure the crew will help us figure out an arrangement that works for everyone. But Daddy Maya persisted with the logical directness that had sometimes embarrassed her parents in social situations. If he's worried about being comfortable, wouldn't it be easier for him to move to a different seat instead of asking you to move? Because you were already assigned this seat by the computer, and Mommy always taught me that when someone gives you something fair and square, other people don't get to take it away just because they want it for themselves. The wisdom embedded in her observation, the fundamental principle of fairness that children understand instinctively, but that adults often complicate with rationalizations and self-serving interpretations, hung in the air like an unspoken indictment of Bradford's entire position. Here was a 12-year-old girl articulating basic concepts of justice and equity with more clarity and moral authority than any of the adults in the situation had managed to achieve. Bradford found himself staring at Maya with a mixture of frustration and grudging recognition that her logic was essentially unassailable. From a purely procedural standpoint, she was absolutely correct. Dr. Washington had been legitimately assigned to seat 1B through the airline's standard upgrade process, and Bradford's objections to that assignment were based on personal preferences rather than any violation of airline policies or passenger rights. The fact that a child could identify and articulate this basic truth while he had been unable to find a convincing counter-argument was deeply irritating to someone who prided himself on his analytical thinking and persuasive abilities. But Bradford's commitment to his own comfort and his ingrained sense of entitlement proved stronger than his ability to acknowledge the logical flaws in his position, and he found himself preparing to escalate the confrontation rather than concede to the reasoning of a 12-year-old girl and her frustratingly diplomatic father. The moment when Bradford Wellington's carefully constructed facade of civilized objection finally cracked and revealed the raw prejudice underneath arrived with the sudden violence of a dam bursting under pressure, triggered by Maya's innocent but relentless questions about fairness, logic, and basic human decency. He had been dancing around the edges of his real concerns, using coded language about passenger compatibility and suitable environments and comfort levels, but a 12-year-old girl's refusal to accept vague euphemisms as adequate explanations had backed him into a corner where his only choices were to admit the racial basis of his objections or to retreat from his position entirely. "Fine." Bradford said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting would have achieved, since you seem determined to make this unnecessarily complicated. "Let me be perfectly clear about what I'm saying. I don't want to sit next to your father because I don't trust black people. I don't feel comfortable around black people, and I certainly don't want to sleep next to a black man during an 8-hour flight where I'm essentially trapped in a confined space with no way to ensure my personal safety or the security of my belongings." The words fell into the first-class cabin like stones dropping into still water, creating expanding ripples of shock, discomfort, and anger that spread from row to row as passengers processed what they had just heard. The elderly woman in pearls dropped her Financial Times with an audible gasp. The tech entrepreneur in 3A stopped pretending to look at his phone and began openly recording the confrontation, and even the flight attendants working in the galley area paused their pre-flight preparations to stare at Bradford with expressions of disbelief and professional concern. Maya's eyes went wide with confusion and hurt as she processed Bradford's words, her 12-year-old mind struggling to understand how an adult could make such sweeping, cruel generalizations about people based on nothing more than the color of their skin. She had been raised in a household where diversity was celebrated, where her father's colleagues and friends came from every conceivable background, and where the idea of judging someone's character or trustworthiness based on their race was not just morally wrong, but practically nonsensical. "But you don't even know my daddy." Maya said, her voice smaller now, but still carrying the stubborn logic that had characterized her previous questions. "How can you not trust someone you've never met? That doesn't make any sense. My daddy saves people's lives every day, and he helps sick children get better, and he's never done anything mean or bad to anybody. Why would you think he might hurt you when he spends all his time helping people?" Dr. Washington felt a surge of protective anger, unlike anything he had experienced since Keisha's death, but he forced himself to maintain the calm composure that had served him through countless similar confrontations over the years. He could see the confusion and pain in his daughter's eyes, could feel the weight of 180 passengers' attention focused on how he would respond to this public attack on his character and integrity. And he understood that his next words would not only shape Maya's understanding of prejudice and injustice, but would also determine whether this situation escalated into something even more damaging and destructive. "Maya," he said gently, kneeling down so that he could look directly into her eyes. "Sometimes people have ideas about other people that aren't based on facts or personal experience, but on fears and misconceptions that they've learned from other sources. It doesn't mean those ideas are correct, and it doesn't mean we should respond with anger or try to convince them they're wrong by arguing with them. Sometimes the best thing we can do is simply demonstrate through our actions and behavior that their assumptions don't match reality." Bradford watched this father-daughter interaction with growing frustration, recognizing that Dr. Washington's patient educational response to his attack was making him appear even more unreasonable and malicious by comparison. He had expected anger, defensiveness, perhaps even aggression, reactions that would have validated his claims about feeling unsafe and uncomfortable around black passengers. Instead, he was witnessing a teaching moment between a father and daughter that highlighted his own ugliness while demonstrating exactly the kind of character and wisdom that he claimed to find threatening. That's exactly the kind of manipulative response I was talking about. Bradford said, his voice rising again as he realized that his position was becoming increasingly untenable. Acting calm and reasonable and educational when what's really happening here is an attempt to make me look like the bad guy for having legitimate concerns about passenger safety and comfort. I've been flying first class for 20 years, and I've never had to deal with situations like this because airlines used to understand that premium passengers expect a certain environment and demographic when they pay for premium service. Sarah Martinez realized that the situation had crossed definitively into territory that required immediate intervention from senior crew members, and she activated her emergency communication device to summon the purser and potentially the captain himself. Federal aviation regulations were absolutely clear about discrimination based on race, and Bradford's explicit statements about his objections to flying with black passengers represented not just a violation of airline policy, but potentially criminal behavior under federal hate crime statutes. The other passengers in first class were no longer making any pretense of ignoring the confrontation, and several of them had their phones out recording what was clearly becoming a viral-worthy incident. The tech entrepreneur in 3A had positioned his device to capture the entire scene, including Maya's confused questions and Dr. Washington's patient responses, and he was already composing social media posts that would spread the footage across multiple platforms within minutes of the flight's landing. Sir Sarah said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone that flight attendants used when passenger behavior crossed from merely disruptive into potentially dangerous territory. I need to inform you that the statements you've made constitute discrimination based on race, which is a violation of federal law as well as airline policy. I'm going to need you to either take your seat and refrain from further discriminatory comments, or I'll be forced to call security to have you removed from the aircraft. Bradford laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor but plenty of contempt for what he viewed as an empty threat from someone he considered powerless to actually affect his situation. "You think you can threaten me with security?" he said, his voice rising to a level that was clearly audible throughout the entire first-class section and probably beyond. "I spend more money on airline tickets in a single year than you make in salary. I know the executives who run this company personally, and I guarantee you that any attempt to remove me from this flight will result in lawsuits, terminations, and consequences that will follow you for the rest of your career. The only person who's going to face consequences here," a new voice said from the aisle behind Bradford, "is the passenger who thinks his bank account gives him the right to abuse other travelers based on the color of their skin." Bradford turned to see Captain David Thompson approaching from the direction of the cockpit, his silver hair gleaming under the cabin lights, and his 4 gold stripes marking him unmistakably as the pilot in command of the aircraft. At 55 years old, Captain Thompson had accumulated over 20,000 flight hours, and had dealt with every conceivable type of passenger emergency security threat and behavioral crisis. But he had never encountered a situation quite like this one. A first-class passenger openly demanding racial segregation in front of a child recorded by multiple witnesses, and showing no inclination to moderate his behavior, despite repeated warnings from the crew. Captain Thompson had been alerted to the situation by Sarah's emergency communication, and he had spent the past few minutes in the cockpit listening to the confrontation through the intercom system while reviewing the federal regulations and airline policies that governed his authority to remove disruptive passengers from the aircraft. What he had heard had convinced him that this was not a situation that could be resolved through standard de-escalation techniques or customer service accommodations. This was a passenger who was creating a hostile environment for other travelers, and who showed no willingness to comply with basic standards of respectful behavior. "I'm Captain Thompson," he said, stopping directly in front of Bradford and fixing him with the kind of steady, authoritative gaze that had commanded respect in military cockpits and commercial flight decks for over 3 decades. "I understand you're having concerns about your seating assignment, and I'm here to inform you that this aircraft will not depart with any passenger who refuses to treat their fellow travelers with basic human dignity and respect." Bradford felt a momentary flicker of uncertainty as he found himself face to face with the one person on the aircraft who possessed absolute authority over the flight's operations. but his anger and sense of entitlement quickly overwhelmed any instinct toward prudence or self-preservation. "Captain," he said, forcing his voice into a tone of reasonable authority that he hoped would establish some kind of peer-to-peer relationship with the pilot. "I appreciate you taking the time to address this situation personally, and I'm sure we can work out an arrangement that satisfies everyone's concerns. I'm simply asking for the kind of accommodation that any premium passenger should be able to expect when traveling in first class. A comfortable, secure environment where I can rest during the flight without having to worry about compatibility issues with adjacent passengers." Captain Thompson studied Bradford's face with the kind of analytical attention that pilots brought to assessing weather conditions, mechanical problems, and other potential threats to flight safety. And he recognized immediately that he was dealing with someone whose sense of reality had been so distorted by privilege and prejudice that he genuinely believed his discriminatory demands were reasonable and justified. "Mr. Wellington." Captain Thompson said, his voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Let me be absolutely clear about something. This aircraft operates under federal aviation regulations that prohibit discrimination based on race, religion, gender, or national origin. Dr. Washington holds a valid ticket for Seat 1B. He has conducted himself with complete propriety throughout this interaction, and your objections to his presence are based solely on racial prejudice that has no place on my aircraft or anywhere else in civilized society." The directness of the captain's statement sent a wave of satisfied murmurs through the cabin as passengers realized they were witnessing a clear moral stand being taken by someone in a position of unquestionable authority. Maya looked up at Captain Thompson with obvious admiration, recognizing instinctively that he was defending her father against the inexplicable hostility they had encountered, while Dr. Washington felt a surge of gratitude mixed with professional respect for a colleague who was willing to risk customer complaints and corporate pressure in order to uphold principles of basic human decency. Bradford, however, interpreted the captain's intervention not as moral leadership, but as another challenge to his authority that needed to be met with even more forceful assertions of his own power and influence. The confrontation between Bradford Wellington and Captain Thompson represented more than just a disagreement about seating arrangements. It was a collision between two fundamentally different philosophies about power, authority, and the responsibilities that come with both. Bradford saw his wealth and social status as granting him the right to shape his environment according to his personal preferences, while Captain Thompson understood his position as pilot in command to carry the obligation to ensure that every passenger under his authority was treated with equal dignity and respect, regardless of their race background or economic status. Captain Thompson Bradford said, his voice taking on the condescending tone that he typically used with employees who failed to understand the realities of their position relative to his. "I appreciate your dedication to following regulations, but I think you may be misunderstanding the nature of the situation here. I'm not asking you to violate any federal laws or airline policies. I'm simply requesting reasonable accommodations for a passenger who contributes significantly to this airline's profitability and who has legitimate concerns about passenger compatibility that should be addressed through standard customer service protocols." The euphemistic language that Bradford continued to employ, passenger compatibility, reasonable accommodations, legitimate concerns, fooled absolutely no one in the cabin, least of all Captain Thompson, who had heard every possible variation of discriminatory language disguised as customer service requests during his decades in commercial aviation. The pilot's expression remained unchanged as he processed Bradford's attempt to reframe his openly racist demands as business considerations, but the slight tightening around his eyes suggested that his patience with diplomatic solutions was rapidly approaching its limit. Maya had been listening to this adult conversation with growing confusion and distress, her 12-year-old sense of justice struggling to process how someone could speak about her father as if he were a problem to be solved rather than a person deserving of respect and courtesy. She had spent her entire life watching Dr. Washington navigate professional and social situations with grace and competence, earning the admiration and trust of colleagues, patients, and strangers through his skill, kindness, and integrity, and the idea that someone could view him as threatening or undesirable based solely on his appearance was both incomprehensible and deeply hurtful. Daddy Maya said, tugging on Dr. Washington's sleeve with the insistent urgency that children used when they needed immediate attention and answers. I don't understand why this man keeps saying mean things about you when you haven't done anything wrong. Is he sick? Is there something wrong with his brain that makes him scared of people who look different from him? Because when kids at school act mean like this, the teachers usually send them to the counselor to help them figure out why they're being so unkind. The innocent directness of Maya's questions cut through the adult conversation like a sword, highlighting the fundamental absurdity of Bradford's position, while simultaneously demonstrating the kind of moral clarity that children often possessed before they learned to rationalize prejudice and discrimination as acceptable adult behavior. Her suggestion that Bradford might be suffering from some kind of mental or emotional disorder that prevented him from seeing other people clearly was both compassionate and devastating, offering an explanation for his behavior that acknowledged its irrationality while still holding him accountable for the pain it was causing. Doctor. Washington knelt down beside his daughter, his movements careful and deliberate as he tried to balance his desire to protect her from the ugliness of the situation with his recognition that this was becoming a teachable moment that would shape her understanding of prejudice, justice, and moral courage for the rest of her life. He could feel the weight of Captain Thompson's supportive presence, the hostile energy radiating from Bradford, and the intense attention of every passenger and crew member who was witnessing this confrontation. But his primary focus remained on helping Maya process what she was experiencing in a way that would strengthen, rather than damage, her faith in human goodness. Maya, sweetheart doctor. Washington said, his voice carrying the same gentle patience that he used when explaining complex medical procedures to frightened young patients. Sometimes people develop ideas about other people that aren't based on reality, but on fears and misunderstandings that they've learned from their families, their communities, or their experiences. Those ideas can become so strong that they prevent people from seeing others clearly, almost like a sickness that affects their ability to recognize the humanity and worth in people who look different from them. So he is sick. Maya asked, her concern shifting from confusion to a kind of clinical curiosity that reflected both her father's influence and her own naturally inquisitive nature. Can you fix him, Daddy? You fix people's hearts when they're broken. Can you fix whatever's broken inside his heart that makes him say such mean things? The metaphorical perfection of Maya's question, asking whether her father, a cardiac surgeon, could repair the kind of heart condition that manifested as hatred rather than arrhythmia, created a moment of profound silence in the first-class cabin as everyone present absorbed the wisdom embedded in her innocent inquiry. Here was a child asking whether the healing that Dr. Washington brought to his surgical patients could be extended to the kind of spiritual and emotional brokenness that Bradford was displaying. And the question highlighted both the tragedy of prejudice and the possibility of redemption in ways that no adult theological or philosophical discussion could have achieved. Bradford felt his face burning with humiliation as he realized that a 12-year-old girl had just diagnosed him with a form of spiritual sickness, while simultaneously suggesting that her father, the man he had been trying to exclude from first class, possessed the kind of healing power that could address his condition. The role reversal was complete and devastating. The child he had dismissed as irrelevant had become his moral superior, and the man he had tried to dehumanize had been elevated to the status of potential healer and redeemer. "I am not sick," Bradford said, his voice rising to a level that bordered on shouting as his carefully constructed self-image crumbled under the weight of Maya's innocent but penetrating analysis. "I am a successful businessman with legitimate preferences about my travel environment, and I refuse to be lectured by a child or manipulated by her father into accepting arrangements that compromise my comfort and security. This is exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that I was trying to avoid by requesting appropriate seating arrangements in the first place." Captain Thompson had heard enough. In his 30-plus years of aviation experience, he had developed an intuitive ability to distinguish between passengers who were genuinely distressed and those who were simply entitled, between legitimate safety concerns and manufactured grievances, between people who deserved patience and accommodation and those who needed firm boundaries and consequences. Bradford Wellington clearly fell into the latter category in every respect. He was a passenger whose behavior was creating actual safety and security risks for other travelers whose demands were based on illegal discrimination rather than legitimate concerns, and whose escalating aggression suggested that further attempts at diplomatic resolution would be both futile and potentially dangerous. "Mr. Wellington," Captain Thompson said, his voice shifting from diplomatic firmness to command authority. "You have made it clear that you refuse to accept the seating arrangements as assigned, that you object to Dr. Washington's presence based solely on his race, and that you intend to continue creating a hostile environment for other passengers. Under my authority as pilot in command, I am ordering you to either take your assigned seat and conduct yourself respectfully for the remainder of this flight, or to gather your belongings and deplane immediately." The ultimatum hung in the air like a thunderclap, marking the moment when the situation moved from customer service dispute to federal aviation enforcement action. Every passenger in first class understood that they were witnessing a decisive confrontation between civilian entitlement and professional authority, between individual prejudice and institutional responsibility, between the power of money and the power of moral conviction. Bradford stared at Captain Thompson with genuine shock, his mind struggling to process the reality that someone was actually challenging his authority and threatening him with consequences, despite his wealth connections and social status. In his world of exclusive clubs, private jets, and corporate boardrooms, his preferences had always been treated as commands, and his comfort had always been prioritized above all other considerations. The idea that an airline captain, someone he viewed as essentially a highly paid chauffeur, would dare to give him ultimatums was so foreign to his experience that he initially assumed it must be some kind of negotiating tactic designed to get him to moderate his demands. "You can't be serious," Bradford said, his voice combining disbelief with mounting anger as he realized that Captain Thompson was not bluffing or posturing, but was genuinely prepared to remove him from the aircraft. "I am a Diamond Medallion member with over 2 million miles on this airline. My company spends hundreds of thousands of dollars annually on corporate travel, and I personally know executives at the highest levels of your organization. Any attempt to remove me from this flight will result in lawsuits, complaints, and consequences that will end careers and cost this airline millions of dollars in lost business and legal settlements." Captain Thompson absorbed Bradford's threats with the same calm professionalism that he brought to weather emergencies, mechanical failures, and other aviation crises, recognizing that the passenger's escalating desperation and aggression actually confirmed the correctness of his decision to force a resolution to the situation. A passenger who was willing to threaten crew members' careers and the airline's financial stability simply to avoid sitting next to a black doctor was clearly someone whose judgment was so compromised by prejudice and entitlement that he posed a genuine risk to flight safety and passenger welfare. "Mr. Wellington." Captain Thompson replied, his voice carrying the finality of a court judgment. "Your threats and your frequent flyer status are irrelevant to this situation. Federal aviation regulations give me absolute authority over passenger conduct aboard this aircraft, and I have determined that your behavior constitutes a threat to the safety and security of other passengers. You now have 2 minutes to make your choice, take your assigned seat, and conduct yourself respectfully, or gather your belongings and leave the aircraft voluntarily before I call security to have you removed involuntarily." The 2-minute deadline created a moment of crystalline tension in the cabin as 180 passengers and crew members waited to see how Bradford would respond to the most direct challenge to his authority that he had probably ever experienced. Maya clutched her father's hand more tightly, instinctively recognizing that they had reached a moment of decision that would determine not just the immediate outcome of the confrontation, but the broader question of whether justice and decency would prevail over prejudice and entitlement. Maya Washington's response to the escalating confrontation between Bradford and Captain Thompson demonstrated the kind of moral clarity that children often possessed before they learned to rationalize injustice as acceptable adult behavior. While the adults around her were engaged in a complex dance of authority threats and professional protocol, she remained focused on the fundamental human questions that lay at the heart of the conflict. Why was someone being cruel to her father? What could be done to help the obviously troubled man who seemed so angry and frightened? And how could the situation be resolved in a way that honored everyone's dignity while still protecting the innocent from harm? "Excuse me," Maya said, stepping forward with the kind of confident politeness that her father had taught her to use when addressing adults in positions of authority. "Captain Thompson." "Sir, may I ask you a question about what's happening here?" Captain Thompson looked down at the 12-year-old girl with surprise and respect, recognizing that her intervention might offer a perspective on the situation that none of the adults had considered. In his decades of flying, he had often found that children possessed an ability to see through adult complications and contradictions to the essential truth of any situation, and he was curious to hear what Maya's young mind had made of the confrontation that was threatening to ground his flight. Of course, young lady Captain Thompson said, his voice softening slightly as he shifted from command mode to the more gentle tone that experienced adults used when speaking with perceptive children. "What would you like to know?" Maya looked thoughtfully at Bradford, who was still standing in the aisle with his face flushed red and his hands clenched into fists at his sides, and then back at Captain Thompson with the kind of serious expression that suggested she was processing complex information and trying to reach a fair conclusion. "Is this man really dangerous, or is he just scared?" she asked. "Because when kids at my school act mean and say hurtful things, it's usually because they're scared of something they don't understand, and they think that being loud and angry will make the scary thing go away." The question struck at the psychological heart of Bradford's behavior with surgical precision, identifying the fear and insecurity that lay beneath his aggressive entitlement, while simultaneously offering a compassionate framework for understanding his actions without excusing their impact. Maya had essentially diagnosed Bradford's condition as a form of learned helplessness, masquerading as dominance, a defense mechanism that protected his fragile sense of superiority by attacking anything that challenged his worldview. Bradford found himself staring at Maya with a mixture of anger and unwilling recognition, her innocent question having identified truths about his motivation that he had never acknowledged even to himself. The idea that his behavior might stem from fear rather than strength, that his aggression might represent weakness rather than power, was deeply threatening to his self-image as a successful, confident leader who controlled his environment through force of will and financial leverage. "I am not scared of anything," Bradford said, his voice rising defensively as he struggled to maintain his position in the face of a child's devastating analysis. "I am simply a passenger with reasonable expectations about service quality and passenger compatibility, and I refuse to be psychoanalyzed by a 12-year-old girl who has no understanding of the complex business and social dynamics that govern adult interactions in professional environments." Maya considered his response with the kind of thoughtful attention that she brought to difficult homework problems. Her head tilted slightly to one side as she processed his words and compared them to her own observations of his behavior. "But if you're not scared," she said with the relentless logic that made her such a challenging debate partner during family dinner conversations, "then why are you so worried about sitting next to my daddy? He's really nice and he's really smart and he helps sick children get better by fixing their hearts. Most people are happy to sit next to him because he tells interesting stories about his surgeries, and he always shares his snacks if you're hungry." The contrast between Maya's description of her father as someone whose company was sought after and enjoyed by others, and Bradford's portrayal of him as someone to be avoided and feared, highlighted the absurdity of the entire situation in ways that made several passengers smile despite the tension of the moment. Here was a child offering testimonial evidence about her father's character based on years of close observation, while Bradford was making negative judgments based on nothing more than racial prejudice and unfounded assumptions. Dr. Washington watched his daughter navigate this complex social situation with a mixture of pride and protective concern, recognizing that she was demonstrating exactly the kind of moral courage and intellectual honesty that he had tried to instill in her, while also exposing herself to the kind of hatred and irrationality that he had hoped to shield her from for a few more years. Maya's willingness to engage directly with Bradford's hostility, rather than simply accepting it as an inexplicable adult behavior, showed a level of maturity and confidence that was both admirable and heartbreaking. Maya, Dr. Washington said gently, "Sometimes it's better to let adults work through their disagreements without trying to solve their problems for them. This gentleman has concerns that he needs to address with the captain and the crew, and we should probably give them space to find a solution that works for everyone." But Daddy Maya replied with the persistent curiosity that had characterized her questions throughout the confrontation. What if there isn't a solution that works for everyone? What if this man can't be happy unless you go away, and you can't get to London to help the sick little girl unless you stay? Somebody has to decide which thing is more important, his comfort or her life right. The stark moral clarity of Maya's formulation, comfort versus life, personal preference versus medical necessity, individual prejudice versus collective responsibility, cut through all the diplomatic language and customer service euphemisms that had characterized the adult conversation and reduced the situation to its essential ethical components. She had identified the fundamental question that lay at the heart of the conflict. When individual desires conflicted with communal needs, when personal comfort came at the expense of others' well-being, when prejudice threatened to prevent healing, which values should take precedence? Captain Thompson looked at Maya with genuine admiration, recognizing that she had articulated the moral framework that should guide his decision-making with more clarity and wisdom than any corporate training manual or federal regulation could provide. Her question about priorities, comfort or life, reminded him that his role as pilot in command involved not just technical responsibilities for flight safety, but moral obligations to ensure that his aircraft served the cause of human flourishing rather than human diminishment. "Young lady," Captain Thompson said, "you've asked exactly the right question, and you've helped me understand exactly what I need to do in this situation." Bradford watched this exchange between the captain and Maya with growing alarm, recognizing that the child's moral reasoning was undermining his position far more effectively than any adult argument or regulatory citation could have achieved. Her ability to reduce complex social dynamics to simple questions of right and wrong, her refusal to accept euphemistic language as adequate explanation for cruel behavior, and her insistence on considering the broader consequences of individual actions had exposed the selfishness and irrationality of his demands in ways that made them impossible to defend or justify. "This is ridiculous," Bradford said, his voice cracking with frustration and mounting panic as he realized that his usual tools of intimidation and financial leverage were proving completely ineffective against a 12-year-old girl's moral clarity. "I am not going to stand here and be lectured by a child about business decisions and travel arrangements that she has no capacity to understand. I demand to speak with a supervisor. I demand alternative accommodations, and I demand that this situation be resolved in a manner that respects my status as a premium passenger and longtime customer." Maya looked at Bradford with the kind of patient sympathy that she typically reserved for classmates who were struggling with concepts that she found easy to understand, her expression suggesting that she genuinely felt sorry for someone who seemed so confused about basic principles of kindness and fairness. "Mr. Wellington," she said, using his name with the careful formality that children employed when they wanted to be taken seriously by adults, "I think maybe you're making this more complicated than it needs to be. If you're worried about being comfortable during the flight, I could ask the flight attendant if they have any extra pillows or blankets that might help you sleep better. And if you're worried about being safe, you could just talk to my daddy during the flight and you'd see that he's really nice and not scary at all. The innocence of her suggestions, offering practical solutions for the comfort and safety concerns that Bradford claimed to have while completely ignoring the racial dimension of his objections, forced him to confront the reality that his stated reasons for opposing Dr. Washington's presence were pretexts for prejudice that could not be addressed through reasonable accommodation or customer service. A child's willingness to take his expressed concerns at face value and offer helpful solutions had revealed the dishonesty and irrationality at the core of his position. Bradford stared at Maya with a mixture of rage and helplessness, his mind reeling from the realization that everything he had said and done over the past 30 minutes had been systematically dismantled by a 12-year-old girl who refused to accept his prejudice as normal or acceptable adult behavior. Her questions had forced him to confront truths about himself that he had spent decades avoiding. Her suggestions had highlighted the pettiness of his concerns when measured against larger human needs, and her presence had transformed what he had intended as a private customer service dispute into a public moral reckoning that was being recorded and broadcast to the world. The weight of that realization, that his behavior was being documented by multiple passengers and would inevitably become public knowledge, finally broke through his anger and entitlement to touch the part of his mind that was still capable of calculating consequences and protecting his self-interest. But instead of prompting him toward moderation and face-saving retreat, the recognition of his exposure seemed to push him toward even more desperate and destructive choices. Captain David Thompson had spent 35 years in aviation learning to make decisions under pressure, but the situation unfolding in his first-class cabin presented a unique combination of technical, legal, and moral challenges that required him to draw upon every aspect of his training and experience. As he watched Bradford Wellington's increasingly erratic behavior in response to Maya Washington's innocent questions and moral clarity, he recognized that this was no longer a customer service dispute that could be resolved through compromise and accommodation. This was a fundamental test of whether his aircraft would operate according to principles of human dignity and equal treatment, or whether it would become a venue for the kind of discrimination that federal law and basic decency both prohibited. The pilot's military background had taught him that leadership often required making unpopular decisions that prioritized long-term mission success over short-term convenience, and his years in commercial aviation had reinforced the lesson that passenger safety encompassed not just physical security, but emotional and psychological well-being as well. Bradford's explicit statements about his refusal to fly with black passengers had created a hostile environment that threatened the comfort and safety of Dr. Washington Maya, and potentially every other passenger who witnessed or learned about the confrontation. "Mr. Wellington," Captain Thompson said, his voice carrying the authority of command decisions that could not be appealed or negotiated. "You have now had several opportunities to modify your behavior and treat your fellow passengers with the respect that federal law requires and basic humanity demands. Your continued refusal to accept Dr. Washington's legitimate right to occupy his assigned seat, combined with your explicit statements about your racial objections to his presence, has created an unacceptable situation that I cannot allow to continue." Bradford's face had grown increasingly pale as he processed the implications of the captain's words, his mind finally beginning to grasp that his threats and bluster were not producing the compliance he had expected, and that he was facing the very real possibility of consequences that his wealth and status could not prevent or mitigate. The presence of Maya Washington, whose innocent questions had stripped away his pretenses and exposed the ugliness of his motivations, had made it impossible for him to retreat gracefully or reframe his position as anything other than what it obviously was: blatant racial discrimination that no amount of euphemistic language could disguise. Captain Bradford said, his voice taking on a pleading tone that contrasted sharply with his earlier aggression. "Surely we can work out some kind of arrangement that addresses everyone's concerns without resorting to extreme measures. I'm willing to compromise. I'm willing to discuss alternatives, and I'm certainly willing to ensure that this situation doesn't escalate any further." Perhaps there's a way to handle this quietly and professionally without creating unnecessary drama or publicity that could be damaging to everyone involved. The shift in Bradford's approach, from demands and threats to pleas for discretion and compromise, confirmed Captain Thompson's assessment that the passenger's behavior had been motivated by a sense of entitlement that crumbled when faced with genuine consequences. Bradford's sudden concern about unnecessary drama or publicity revealed that he was finally beginning to understand that his actions were being recorded and would likely become public knowledge, with all the personal and professional implications that such exposure would entail. Maya had been listening to this adult conversation with the kind of focused attention that children brought to situations where important decisions were being made that would affect their well-being, and she could sense that Captain Thompson was preparing to take some kind of action that would resolve the conflict, but might also have significant consequences for everyone involved. Her 12-year-old mind was processing not just the immediate dynamics of the confrontation, but the broader moral questions about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of redemption that had been raised by her father's patient responses to Bradford's hostility. "Captain Thompson," Maya said, stepping forward with the kind of respectful determination that suggested she had something important to say before you decide what to do about Mr. Wellington. "Could I ask him one more question?" Captain Thompson looked down at Maya with curiosity and respect, recognizing that her previous interventions had consistently moved the situation toward greater clarity and moral focus. "Of course," he said. "What would you like to ask?" Maya turned to face Bradford directly, her expression combining the earnest concern of childhood with a wisdom that seemed far beyond her years. "Mr. Wellington," she said, "do you have children?" The question hit Bradford like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality that his behavior was being witnessed and evaluated not just by adults who might understand the complexities of business and social hierarchies, but by a child who saw the world in terms of simple moral categories: kindness and cruelty, fairness and injustice, love and hate. The idea that his own children might someday see footage of this confrontation, that they might have to explain to their friends why their father had been recorded making racist statements on an airplane, was more terrifying than any professional or financial consequences he might face. Yes, Bradford said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I have 2 children, a son who's 14 and a daughter who's 10. Maya nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had confirmed an important hypothesis. "Do you think they would be proud of how you're acting right now?" she asked. "Do you think they would want their friends to see a video of their daddy being mean to other people just because of what they look like? Because if I saw my daddy acting like this, I would be really sad and embarrassed, and I would want him to apologize and try to do better." The moral devastation of Maya's question was complete and undeniable. Bradford found himself forced to imagine his own children watching footage of his behavior, seeing their father expose himself as someone capable of casual cruelty and racial hatred, having to defend or distance themselves from actions that violated every principle of decency that he had supposedly tried to teach them. The realization that Maya Washington, the daughter of the man he had been trying to exclude and diminish, was demonstrating more maturity, wisdom, and moral clarity than he had shown during the entire confrontation was almost unbearably humiliating. Dr. Washington watched his daughter confront Bradford with a mixture of pride and concern, recognizing that she was displaying exactly the kind of moral courage that he had tried to instill in her, while also exposing herself to the kind of adult ugliness that he had hoped to protect her from for many more years. Maya's willingness to appeal to Bradford's better angels to assume that he possessed parental love and conscience that could be awakened by the right questions showed a level of faith in human redemption that was both inspiring and heartbreaking. Captain Thompson realized that Maya had created the perfect moment for decisive action. Bradford had been forced to confront the moral implications of his behavior in the most personal terms possible. The other passengers had witnessed both the ugliness of discrimination and the beauty of childlike wisdom, and the situation had reached a point where further delay would only increase the trauma and damage for everyone involved, Mr. Wellington. Captain Thompson said, his voice carrying the finality of a judgment that could not be appealed. You now have exactly 60 seconds to make your choice. You can take your assigned seat, conduct yourself with the respect and dignity that every passenger on this aircraft deserves, and complete this journey as part of a community of travelers who treat each other as fellow human beings. Or you can gather your belongings and leave this aircraft immediately, because I will not pilot a plane where passengers are subjected to racial abuse and discrimination. The ultimatum hung in the air with the weight of absolute authority, marking the moment when all of Bradford's wealth connections and social status proved powerless in the face of moral conviction backed by legitimate institutional authority. Captain Thompson had made it clear that the choice was entirely Bradford's, but that the consequences of that choice would be immediate, public, and irreversible. Bradford looked around the cabin, desperately searching for some source of support or sympathy that might provide him with a face-saving alternative to complete capitulation or humiliating defeat. But the faces that met his gaze reflected a range of emotions from disgust to pity to contempt, and he realized that his behavior had isolated him completely from the community of passengers whose respect and approval he had assumed he could take for granted. Maya Washington stood quietly beside her father, her hand in his, watching Bradford with the kind of patient attention that suggested she was still hoping he might choose redemption over defiance, kindness over cruelty, growth over stagnation. Her presence served as a constant reminder that his actions were being evaluated not just by his peers, but by the next generation, and that the choices he made in this moment would ripple forward into a future where tolerance, respect, and human dignity would either be strengthened or weakened by his example. The 60 seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity as Bradford wrestled with the most consequential decision of his adult life, knowing that whatever choice he made would define not only his own future, but his children's understanding of their father's character and moral worth. Bradford Wellington's decision, when it finally came, surprised no one who had been paying attention to the escalation of his behavior throughout the confrontation, but it still sent shockwaves through the cabin as passengers realized they were witnessing the complete moral collapse of a man who had chosen his prejudice over his dignity, his hatred over his humanity, his selfishness over any possibility of redemption. Rather than accepting Captain Thompson's final ultimatum with grace or even grudging compliance, Bradford doubled down on his position with a vehemence that made his earlier statements seem restrained by comparison. "This is absolutely unacceptable," Bradford shouted, his voice rising to a level that could be heard throughout the entire aircraft. His face flushed red with a combination of rage, humiliation, and desperate defiance. "I am not going to be bullied and manipulated by airline employees, lectured by children, or forced to accept travel arrangements that compromise my safety and comfort because of some misguided political correctness agenda that puts the feelings of certain passengers above the legitimate concerns of premium customers who actually pay the bills that keep this airline in business." The ugly rhetoric that poured from Bradford's mouth in that moment revealed the full extent of his moral bankruptcy as he attempted to reframe his racial discrimination as victimization, his cruelty as customer service, and his selfishness as economic necessity. The contrast between his desperate justifications and Maya Washington's quiet dignity, between his explosive anger and Dr. Washington's patient grace, between his entitled demands and Captain Thompson's principled leadership, could not have been more stark or devastating. Maya flinched at the volume and venom in Bradford's voice, instinctively moving closer to her father's protective presence while maintaining her direct gaze at the man whose behavior continued to baffle and sadden her. Even at 12 years old, she could recognize that she was witnessing an adult who had lost control of himself so completely that he was saying and doing things that would have consequences far beyond anything he could currently comprehend, and her expression reflected both fear and pity for someone who seemed determined to destroy his own life in pursuit of a principle that made no sense to her moral understanding. Furthermore, Bradford continued, his voice taking on the threatening tone that had intimidated countless business rivals and subordinates over the years. "I want everyone in this cabin to understand exactly what's happening here. I am being discriminated against because of my race, my economic status, and my legitimate expectation of receiving the kind of service that my financial contributions to this airline should guarantee. The real racism in this situation is the assumption that I should be forced to accept arrangements that make me uncomfortable simply to accommodate passengers who may not share my values, background, or commitment to maintaining the standards that make first-class travel worthwhile." The breathtaking audacity of Bradford's attempt to claim victim status while simultaneously expressing racist views left the entire cabin momentarily speechless as passengers struggled to process the psychological gymnastics required to transform discriminatory behavior into claims of reverse discrimination. Several passengers began shaking their heads in disbelief, while others reached for their phones to ensure that Bradford's words were being captured and preserved for posterity. Dr. Washington felt a surge of protective anger as he listened to Bradford's tirade, but he forced himself to maintain the calm composure that had served him through countless similar confrontations over the years. He could see the confusion and hurt in Maya's eyes as she processed Bradford's attempt to portray her father as the aggressor and himself as the victim, and he knew that his response to this moment would shape not only the immediate outcome of the situation, but also his daughter's understanding of how to respond to injustice with dignity and strength. "Mr. Wellington." Dr. Washington said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in operating rooms around the world. "I understand that you're upset, but I need to ask you to consider the impact that your words are having on everyone in this cabin, including my daughter, who is trying to understand why an adult would choose to express such hostility toward people he's never met. Your discomfort with my presence doesn't justify language that demeans and dehumanizes others, and it certainly doesn't warrant exposing children to the kind of hatred that serves no constructive purpose." The calm reasonableness of Dr. Washington's response only seemed to inflame Bradford further, as if the other man's refusal to become angry or defensive somehow represented an additional insult to his authority and a further challenge to his worldview. Bradford had expected his escalating aggression to provoke some kind of reaction that would justify his behavior and validate his assumptions, but instead he found himself facing the same patient dignity that had characterized Dr. Washington's demeanor throughout the entire confrontation. Captain Thompson had heard enough. In his decades of aviation experience, he had developed an intuitive sense for when situations had passed the point of possible resolution through dialogue and compromise, and Bradford's increasingly unhinged behavior clearly indicated that further attempts at diplomacy would be both futile and potentially dangerous. The passengers' explicit statements of racial discrimination, combined with his threats against crew members and his escalating aggression in the presence of children, had created exactly the kind of hostile environment that federal aviation regulations were designed to prevent. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Thompson announced, his voice carrying throughout the cabin as he activated the aircraft's public address system. "This is your captain speaking. Due to a passenger conduct issue that cannot be resolved through normal protocols, I am making the decision to deplane this aircraft and delay our departure until the situation can be properly addressed by airport security and federal authorities. I apologize for any inconvenience this may cause to passengers who have conducted themselves appropriately throughout this incident." The announcement sent a ripple of murmurs and gasps through the cabin as 180 passengers realized that their flight to London was being canceled because of one man's refusal to treat a fellow passenger with basic human respect. The tech entrepreneur in seat 3A had been live-streaming the entire confrontation to his social media followers, and the viewer count had climbed into the thousands as people shared the footage and commentary spread across multiple platforms in real time. Bradford stared at Captain Thompson with genuine shock and disbelief, his mind struggling to process the reality that his threats and intimidation tactics had not only failed to produce the compliance he expected, but had resulted in consequences that would affect his ability to complete his business trip. maintain his professional obligations, and preserve his public reputation. The realization that the airline captain was actually prepared to cancel an entire flight rather than accommodate his discriminatory demands was so foreign to his experience that he initially assumed it must be some kind of negotiating tactic designed to force his compliance. "You cannot be serious," Bradford said, his voice cracking with a combination of disbelief and mounting panic as the implications of the captain's decision began to sink in. "You're going to cancel an entire flight, disappoint 180 passengers, cost the airline hundreds of thousands of dollars, and create a public relations nightmare because you refuse to make reasonable accommodations for a premium passenger with legitimate concerns about travel conditions. This is exactly the kind of poor business decision-making that will result in lawsuits, job losses, and permanent damage to this airline's reputation. Mr. Wellington." Captain Thompson replied, his voice carrying the finality of a court judgment. "The only person responsible for this situation is the passenger who refused multiple opportunities to treat his fellow travelers with the respect that federal law requires and basic decency demands. Your explicit statements of racial discrimination have been recorded by multiple witnesses. Your behavior has created a hostile environment for other passengers, and your continued presence on this aircraft would constitute a violation of federal aviation regulations that I am sworn to uphold." Maya looked up at her father with a mixture of sadness and confusion, her 12-year-old mind struggling to understand how an adult could make choices that were so obviously self-destructive and harmful to others. "Daddy," she whispered, "is Mr. Wellington going to be okay? He seems like he's really hurting inside, and I'm worried that he's going to do something that will make things even worse for him and his children." The compassion embedded in Maya's concern for Bradford's well-being, even after witnessing his cruel and discriminatory behavior toward her father, demonstrated exactly the kind of moral maturity and emotional intelligence that Dr. Washington had tried to cultivate in her throughout her young life. Her ability to separate Bradford's actions from his humanity, to recognize his pain while still holding him accountable for the harm he was causing, represented the highest form of moral reasoning that many adults never achieved. Dr. Washington squeezed his daughter's hand gently, drawing strength from her wisdom, while also feeling a renewed sense of responsibility to handle this situation in a way that would honor her faith in human redemption and the possibility of positive change. "I think Mr. Wellington is going through something very difficult right now," he said softly. "And sometimes when people are struggling with feelings they don't understand, they make choices that hurt others and themselves. The most important thing we can do is to remain kind and hopeful, while also protecting ourselves and others from behavior that causes harm." 3 uniformed officers entered the jet bridge. 3 uniformed officers entered the aircraft, their presence immediately shifting the atmosphere from customer service dispute to law enforcement action, as Bradford realized that his situation had escalated far beyond anything his money or connections could easily resolve. As the security officers approached his position in the first-class aisle, Bradford made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation by appealing to their assumed sympathy for his position as a successful businessman being victimized by political correctness and reverse discrimination. But his increasingly frantic explanations only served to confirm the officers' assessment that they were dealing with a passenger whose judgment had been so compromised by prejudice and entitlement that he posed a genuine risk to the safety and well-being of everyone on board. The moment when Bradford Wellington was finally escorted off Flight 847. His expensive briefcase clutched in his trembling hands, and his face flushed with humiliation and rage, marked the end of more than just a passenger dispute. It represented the complete collapse of a worldview that had sustained him for over 5 decades, the destruction of a reputation that had taken decades to build, and the beginning of consequences that would ripple through every aspect of his personal and professional life for years to come. The viral footage of Bradford Wellington's racist tirade and subsequent removal from Flight 847 spread across social media platforms with the devastating speed and reach that only the most shocking examples of human behavior could achieve, transforming him overnight from an obscure hedge fund manager into the most reviled man in America. Within 6 hours of the incident, the hashtag racist on a plane was trending on every major platform. The video had accumulated over 2 million views, and Bradford's name, face, and professional affiliations were being shared and discussed by millions of people who had never heard of him before, but who now knew him as the embodiment of privileged bigotry and entitled racism. The tech entrepreneur in seat 3A, whose live streaming of the confrontation had captured every word and gesture with high-definition clarity, had initially intended to share the footage only with his immediate followers, as an example of the kind of discrimination that still persisted in modern society. But the combination of Bradford's explicit racist statements, Maya Washington's wisdom and dignity, and Captain Thompson's principled leadership had created a narrative so compelling and morally clear that it transcended typical social media attention spans and became the kind of cultural moment that demanded widespread sharing and commentary. Bradford's first awareness of his newfound notoriety came through a series of increasingly frantic phone calls from his assistant, his lawyer, and his wife, all of whom had begun receiving calls from journalists, activists, and concerned friends who had seen the footage and were seeking comment or clarification about his behavior. Patricia Wellington, who had been shopping at their East Hampton estate when the first calls came in, initially assumed that some kind of business scandal or financial irregularity had exposed her husband to negative publicity. But the reality of his racist statements and public humiliation proved far more devastating than any corporate malfeasance could have been. Bradford. Patricia said when she finally reached him on his cell phone as he sat in the JFK Airport security office waiting for processing by federal authorities. "What in God's name have you done? My phone hasn't stopped ringing. The children's school has already called asking about the situation, and I've had 3 different reporters show up at our house asking for comments about your behavior on that airplane. Please tell me this is some kind of misunderstanding or that the video has been edited or taken out of context." Bradford's attempts to explain the situation to his wife revealed the same combination of self-pity and rationalization that had characterized his behavior throughout the confrontation, as he portrayed himself as the victim of an airline's failure to provide appropriate customer service and a media campaign designed to destroy successful businessmen who dared to express legitimate concerns about travel safety and comfort. But Patricia had already watched the footage multiple times, and her husband's transparent attempts to reframe his obvious racism as victimization only confirmed her growing realization that she was married to someone whose true character was far uglier than she had ever suspected. "I watched the video, Bradford," Patricia said, her voice taking on the cold, distant tone that had preceded every major argument in their 20-year marriage, "and I heard exactly what you said to that doctor and his daughter. There's no context that makes your behavior acceptable. No misunderstanding that explains away your racist statements, and no amount of spin that can transform your cruelty into victimization. You have destroyed our family's reputation, exposed our children to ridicule and shame, and revealed yourself to be exactly the kind of person that I have spent my entire adult life trying to distance myself from." The conversation ended with Patricia informing Bradford that she was immediately flying to Paris with their children, that she would be filing for divorce within the week, and that he should not attempt to contact her or the children until his legal situation had been resolved, and he had undergone the kind of psychological counseling that might address whatever deep-seated issues had led to his public breakdown. The speed and finality of her decision shocked Bradford more than any other consequence of his behavior, as he realized that his wife's support and loyalty, which he had always taken for granted, had been contingent upon a public reputation that he had now irrevocably destroyed. Meanwhile, the professional consequences of Bradford's viral notoriety were unfolding with equal speed and severity across every aspect of his business empire. Roger Henderson, the chairman of Bradford's hedge fund, had called an emergency board meeting within hours of the footage going public, and the unanimous decision to terminate Bradford's employment and remove his name from the company had been announced in a press release that distanced the firm from his personal views and behavior that are completely inconsistent with our corporate values and commitment to diversity and inclusion. The Meridian Medical Technologies acquisition, which had represented the capstone deal of Bradford's career and the foundation for his transition into the upper echelons of global finance, was canceled with equal swiftness as the company's board of directors, led by Chairman Sir Emmanuel Oak, whom Bradford still didn't realize was the same Dr. Washington he had abused on the airplane, voted unanimously to terminate all negotiations and business relationships with any entity associated with his name or reputation. Bradford's attempts to salvage his professional relationships through apology explanation and desperate appeals to longtime colleagues and business partners proved entirely futile, as everyone who had previously sought his favor and courted his approval now treated him as toxic and radioactive. The same wealth and success that had once guaranteed him access to exclusive social circles, business opportunities, and political influence now meant nothing in the face of footage that showed him expressing racist views in front of a child. And he discovered that his previous assumptions about loyalty, friendship, and mutual self-interest had been built on foundations far more fragile than he had ever imagined. The physical and emotional toll of his sudden fall from grace manifested in increasingly severe health problems as Bradford struggled to process the complete destruction of everything he had spent his adult life building. The stress of multiple lawsuits, criminal charges, financial ruin, and social ostracism triggered a cascade of physiological responses that his body was not equipped to handle. And within weeks of the airplane incident, he was experiencing chest pains, shortness of breath, and episodes of anxiety so severe that he frequently found himself unable to leave his increasingly modest accommodations without experiencing panic attacks. The irony that his hatred toward a cardiac surgeon had ultimately contributed to his own heart condition was lost on Bradford in his deteriorating state as he became increasingly focused on immediate survival rather than philosophical reflection about the connections between his actions and their consequences. His attempts to secure adequate medical care were complicated by his growing financial constraints and his toxic public reputation, as many healthcare providers were reluctant to associate their practices with someone whose racist behavior had become a symbol of everything wrong with American society. Dr. Elijah Washington, meanwhile, had successfully completed the complex cardiac surgery on 7-year-old Sophie Chen at Great Ormond Street Hospital, saving the child's life through a procedure that required 14 hours of microscopic precision and innovative techniques that pushed the boundaries of pediatric cardiac surgery. The success of the operation, combined with the global attention that the airplane incident had brought to his work and character, had resulted in invitations to speak, consult, and teach at medical centers around the world. But he remained focused primarily on his dual responsibilities as Maya's father and as a healer whose skills were needed by children whose lives hung in the balance. Maya had processed the airplane confrontation with the remarkable resilience that children often displayed when faced with adult ugliness. But her questions about Bradford's well-being and her continuing concern for his children had prompted ongoing conversations with her father about forgiveness, consequences, and the possibility of redemption, even for people who had made terrible choices. Her ability to maintain compassion for someone who had treated her father with such cruelty had strengthened Dr. Washington's own commitment to the healing profession that had defined his life's work. The contrast between Bradford's accelerating descent into isolation, poverty, and physical illness, and Dr. Washington's continued rise in professional recognition and personal fulfillment illustrated the long-term consequences of the choices that both men had made during their brief encounter on Flight 847. One had chosen hatred, selfishness, and moral cowardice, while the other had maintained dignity, compassion, and commitment to serving others, and the universe seemed determined to demonstrate which approach led to genuine success and satisfaction. Bradford's rock bottom came exactly 6 months after the airplane incident, when a massive heart attack struck him while he was alone in his studio apartment in Queens, surrounded by unpaid bills, legal documents, and the detritus of a life that had collapsed so completely that he no longer recognized it as his own. As he lay on the cheap linoleum floor, gasping for breath and clutching his chest, his final conscious thought before losing consciousness was a desperate wish that he could somehow undo the choices that had brought him to this moment of ultimate vulnerability and isolation. Dr. Elijah Washington's return from London had been marked by the kind of professional recognition and personal satisfaction that represented the highest rewards of a medical career dedicated to saving children's lives and advancing the boundaries of cardiac surgery. The successful operation on Sophie Chen had not only preserved the life of a 7-year-old girl whose previous surgeries had left her heart in a condition that most surgeons would have considered inoperable, but had also demonstrated innovative techniques that would benefit countless other children facing similar life-threatening conditions in the years to come. The global attention that the airplane incident had brought to Dr. Washington's work had resulted in invitations to present his surgical innovations at medical conferences around the world, consulting opportunities with the most prestigious cardiac surgery programs and research funding that would allow him to develop new approaches to treating congenital heart defects in children from underserved communities. But despite the professional accolades and expanded opportunities, his primary focus remained on the day-to-day work of healing individual patients and raising Maya with the kind of wisdom and compassion that would enable her to navigate a world where prejudice and hatred still existed, but where dignity and moral courage could ultimately prevail. Maya's processing of the confrontation with Bradford Wellington had evolved over the months following the incident as her 12-year-old mind worked to integrate the experience of witnessing adult cruelty with her fundamental faith in human goodness and the possibility of redemption. Her questions about Bradford's well-being had become more sophisticated and nuanced as she learned more about the consequences that had befallen him, and she had begun to express concerns about whether someone who had made such terrible choices could ever find a path back to becoming a better person. Daddy Maya had asked during one of their evening conversations several months after the airplane incident, "Do you think Mr. Wellington's children are okay? I keep thinking about what it must be like for them to see their father on all those videos and to have other kids at school probably saying mean things about their family. It must be really hard to love someone who did something so wrong, but who is still your parent." The depth of Maya's empathy for children she had never met, who were connected to her only through their relationship to someone who had treated her father with racist cruelty, demonstrated exactly the kind of moral maturity that Dr. Washington had tried to cultivate in her throughout her young life. Her ability to separate Bradford's actions from his children's needs to recognize that innocent people were suffering because of choices they had no control over represented the highest form of compassionate thinking that many adults never achieved. Dr. Washington had used Maya's questions as opportunities to discuss complex themes of justice, mercy, consequences, and forgiveness, helping her understand that holding people accountable for harmful behavior was not inconsistent with hoping for their eventual healing and redemption. These conversations had strengthened both of their commitments to the kind of life that served others rather than merely pursuing personal success or comfort, and they had deepened their appreciation for the privilege and responsibility that came with being able to heal rather than harm. It was during one of these philosophical discussions that Dr. Washington received the phone call that would test every principle and commitment that had guided his medical career and personal ethics. The caller was Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the chief of emergency medicine at St. Mary's Hospital in Manhattan, and her voice carried the kind of urgent professional concern that indicated a life-threatening medical situation requiring immediate consultation and possible intervention. "Dr. Washington," she said, "I have a patient who was brought in 3 hours ago following a massive myocardial infarction, and his condition is deteriorating rapidly despite our best efforts at stabilization. The damage to his heart is extensive, and our cardiac surgery team believes that he needs the kind of complex valve repair and reconstruction that only a handful of surgeons in the world have the experience to perform successfully. We were hoping you might be able to review his case and possibly consider taking him on as an emergency patient. Doctor. Washington's reputation for handling the most challenging and complex cardiac cases had made him the go-to consultant for situations where other surgeons had exhausted their options, and he had built his career on accepting responsibility for patients whose lives hung in the balance between innovative surgical intervention and inevitable death. His initial response was the same professional commitment that characterized his approach to all such requests, a willingness to review the medical records immediately and make himself available for surgery if his skills could make the difference between life and death. Of course, Dr. Washington replied, "Please send me all the scans, lab results, and surgical notes immediately, and I can be at the hospital within an hour if you need me to evaluate the patient in person. What's the patient's name and current condition?" The pause that followed. Doctor. Martinez's question was longer than typical medical communication would normally require, and when she finally spoke again, her voice carried a note of uncertainty and concern that went beyond purely clinical considerations. "The patient's name is Bradford Wellington," she said, "and I should mention that our staff has recognized him as the man from that airplane incident several months ago. I wanted to make sure you were aware of that connection before you made your decision about whether to take the case." The name hit Dr. Washington like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the reality that the man who had publicly expressed racist hatred toward him and exposed Maya to that ugliness was now lying in a hospital bed depending on the very medical expertise that he had dismissed and dehumanized. The irony was so profound and the moral complexity so overwhelming that Dr. Washington found himself temporarily speechless as he processed the implications of what Dr. Martinez was telling him. Maya, who had been reading nearby and had noticed the change in her father's expression during the phone call, looked up from her book with the kind of concerned curiosity that characterized her response to any situation where her father seemed troubled or uncertain. "Is everything okay, Daddy?" she asked. "Is there a child who needs surgery?" The innocence of Maya's question, her automatic assumption that her father's medical expertise would be called upon to save a child, provided stark contrast to the reality that he was being asked to save the life of an adult whose behavior had demonstrated the kind of moral sickness that was far more difficult to cure than any cardiac condition. But her presence also reminded him of the conversations they had been having about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility that even people who had made terrible choices might deserve the chance to become better. "It's not a child, Doctor," Washington said carefully, "but it is someone who needs the kind of surgery that might save his life. The patient is someone we've encountered before. Mr. Wellington, the man from the airplane." Maya's eyes widened with surprise and concern as she processed this information, her mind immediately jumping to the implications and moral questions that the situation raised. "The man who was so mean to you?" she asked. "Is he going to die if you don't help him?" The directness of Maya's question cut to the heart of the ethical dilemma that Dr. Washington was facing. The Hippocratic oath that had guided his medical career demanded that he put patient welfare above personal considerations. But the human part of him that had been wounded by Bradford's racism and concerned about Maya's exposure to hatred was struggling with the idea of extending his healing skills to someone who had treated them both with such cruelty. "He might," Dr. Washington answered honestly. "His heart is very badly damaged, and without surgery he probably won't survive. But the surgery would be very difficult and risky, and there's no guarantee that it would be successful even if everything went perfectly." Maya considered this information with the kind of serious attention that she brought to all moral questions, her expression reflecting the internal debate between justice and mercy that characterized the most challenging ethical decisions that humans faced. "What do you think Mommy would want you to do?" she asked, finally invoking the memory of Keisha Washington's compassionate wisdom as the standard for moral decision-making. The question pierced through all of Dr. Washington's intellectual analysis and emotional conflict to touch the deepest source of his commitment to healing and service. Keisha had always believed that medical skills were gifts that came with the obligation to use them for the benefit of all patients, regardless of their background, behavior, or personal worthiness, and she had consistently challenged him to extend compassion even to people who had difficulty extending it to others. I think Dr. Washington said slowly that Mommy would remind me that being a doctor means treating the disease, not judging the patient. She would probably say that Mr. Wellington's heart condition is something I can try to heal, even if the condition of his soul is something that only he can address. Maya smiled with satisfaction at her father's response, recognizing that he had arrived at the kind of moral conclusion that honored both his professional obligations and the values that had guided their family's life together. "Then you should try to save him," she said with the confidence of someone who had no doubt about the correct course of action. "And maybe when he gets better, he'll remember that you helped him even after he was mean to you, and maybe that will help him become a better person." The wisdom embedded in Maya's reasoning, the possibility that an act of grace might catalyze genuine transformation in someone who had been trapped by his own hatred and fear, provided Dr. Washington with the moral clarity he needed to make his decision. He called Dr. Martinez back within minutes to confirm that he would take Bradford's case, and within an hour he was standing in the cardiac surgery unit preparing to perform the most ethically complex operation of his distinguished career. The surgery that Dr. Elijah Washington performed to save Bradford Wellington's life lasted 11 hours and required every technique, innovation, and insight that he had developed over 2 decades of cardiac surgery, pushing the boundaries of what was medically possible while working to repair damage that extended far beyond the physical trauma to Bradford's heart. The operation involved reconstructing 3 damaged valves, clearing multiple arterial blockages, and installing a network of stents and grafts that would allow blood to flow properly through a cardiovascular system that had been ravaged by stress-poor lifestyle choices and the physiological impact of sustained hatred and anger. Throughout the surgery, Dr. Washington found himself reflecting on the profound irony of the situation, that his hands, which Bradford had viewed as threatening and untrustworthy because of their race, were now performing microscopic repairs that would determine whether Bradford lived or died. The same medical expertise that Bradford had dismissed and dehumanized was now his only hope for survival, and the same compassionate commitment to healing that had characterized Dr. Washington's approach to all patients was being extended to someone who had publicly declared his unwillingness to share confined space with Black people. Maya had spent the day of the surgery at the hospital completing her homeschool assignments in the family waiting area, while periodically checking with the surgical staff about her father's progress and Bradford's condition. Her presence in the hospital that day served as a constant reminder to Dr. Washington of the values and principles that had guided his decision to take the case and her genuine concern for Bradford's well-being, despite his previous cruelty toward her family, demonstrated the kind of moral maturity that continued to inspire and challenge her father when Dr. Washington finally emerged from the operating room after the successful completion of the surgery. His first conversation was with Maya, who had been waiting patiently for news about whether the operation had achieved its goals. "How is Mr. Wellington, Daddy?" she asked with the immediate concern that characterized her response to any situation involving someone's health and safety. "Were you able to fix his heart?" "Physically, yes." Dr. Washington replied, his exhaustion from the 11-hour procedure evident in his voice, but tempered by the satisfaction that came from successfully completing a challenging case. "His heart is beating properly now, and if he follows the recovery protocol and makes the lifestyle changes that his condition requires, he should be able to live a normal lifespan." But fixing the physical damage was the easy part. The harder work of healing whatever caused him to become so filled with hatred and fear is something that only he can do. Maya nodded with the understanding that came from their previous conversations about the relationship between physical and spiritual health, recognizing that her father had addressed only one dimension of Bradford's condition, while the more fundamental problems remained unresolved. "Do you think he'll want to do that harder work?" she asked. Do you think almost dying will make him realize that being mean to other people was hurting him more than it was hurting them? The question reflected Maya's growing sophistication in thinking about human psychology and moral development, as she had come to understand that cruelty often originated from the cruel person's own pain and insecurity rather than from any actual threat posed by their targets. Her hope that Bradford's near-death experience might catalyze genuine self-examination and character change demonstrated both her faith in human redemption and her realistic understanding of how difficult such transformation could be. Bradford's recovery from the surgery was complicated by more than just the physical challenges of healing from major cardiac reconstruction. He awakened to find himself completely dependent on the medical expertise of the man he had publicly degraded, financially ruined by the consequences of his racist behavior, and facing a future that bore no resemblance to the life of privilege and influence that he had taken for granted before his moral collapse on Flight 847. The cognitive dissonance between his previous assumptions about racial superiority and his current reliance on a black surgeon's skills for his very survival created a psychological crisis that was almost as threatening as the cardiac emergency that had brought him to the hospital. Doctor. Washington's approach to Bradford's post-surgical care reflected the same professional competence and compassionate attention that he brought to all his patients, but it also included a level of moral education that went beyond typical medical treatment. During their daily consultations about Bradford's recovery progress, Dr. Washington consistently treated him with dignity and respect, while also helping him understand the connections between emotional health and physical well-being, between hatred and self-destruction, between isolation and healing. Mr. Wellington. Dr. Washington said during one of their early post-surgical conversations, "Your heart attack wasn't caused solely by genetic factors or dietary choices. It was significantly influenced by the chronic stress and elevated cortisol levels that result from sustained anger, fear, and social isolation. If you want to prevent future cardiac events, you'll need to address not just your physical rehabilitation, but also the emotional and psychological factors that contributed to your condition." Bradford listened to these explanations with the reluctant attention of someone who recognized their truth, but was struggling to accept their implications for his own behavior and choices. The idea that his racist attitudes had literally contributed to his heart attack, that his hatred had been as medically dangerous as any lifestyle factor, was both humiliating and enlightening as he began to understand the physiological costs of the emotional toxicity he had cultivated for decades. Maya's visits to Bradford during his recovery period provided some of the most powerful opportunities for healing and growth, as her presence forced him to confront the reality that his racist statements had been made in front of a child whose wisdom and compassion had consistently surpassed his own throughout their interactions. Her continued concern for his well-being, despite the cruelty he had shown toward her father, created cognitive dissonance that began to crack the shell of defensive rationalization that had protected his prejudices from serious examination. "Mr. Wellington," Maya said during one of her visits, "I'm glad that you're getting better and that your heart is working properly now. I was worried about you after the airplane because you seemed so scared and angry, and I didn't want anything terrible to happen to you or your children." The genuine care in Maya's voice, combined with her reference to his own children, forced Bradford to confront questions about the kind of father and role model he had been before his public breakdown, and the kind of person he might become if he chose to learn from his near-death experience rather than simply surviving it. Her ability to separate his actions from his humanity to express concern for his well-being while still acknowledging the harm his behavior had caused provided him with a model for the kind of moral thinking that he had never developed in his own life. The court-ordered community service that was part of Bradford's legal settlement for his discriminatory behavior on the airplane had assigned him to work at a free medical clinic that Dr. Washington had founded to provide cardiac care for uninsured and underinsured patients in low-income communities. The irony of the assignment, that his punishment for racist behavior was to serve in a facility created by his victim, was not lost on Bradford, but it also provided him with daily opportunities to witness the kind of dedication and compassion that had motivated Dr. Washington's entire career. Working alongside nurses, social workers, and volunteer physicians who had dedicated their lives to serving patients regardless of their ability to pay, Bradford began to develop a different understanding of what constituted meaningful work and genuine success. The contrast between the empty pursuit of wealth and status that had previously defined his life and the daily satisfaction that came from helping people address their medical needs created a gradual shift in his values and priorities that surprised him with its depth and authenticity. The patients at the clinic, many of whom were from racial and ethnic backgrounds that Bradford had previously viewed with suspicion or contempt, consistently treated him with kindness and gratitude despite his obvious lack of medical training and his initial awkwardness in providing service rather than commanding it. Their acceptance of his assistance, combined with their stories of struggle and resilience, began to break down the stereotypes and assumptions that had fueled his racist attitudes for so many years. The transformation of Bradford Wellington from racist hedge fund manager to dedicated community service volunteer had unfolded over 18 months of gradual but profound change, marked by small daily choices to extend kindness rather than judgment, to seek understanding rather than confirmation of pre-existing beliefs, and to find meaning through service to others rather than through the accumulation of wealth and status. The journey had been neither easy nor straightforward, requiring him to confront decades of ingrained prejudice, entitled behavior, and the comfortable assumptions that had allowed him to navigate the world without seriously considering the perspectives or experiences of people who looked different from him. The free medical clinic where Bradford had initially been assigned to complete his court-ordered community service had become the central focus of his new life, providing him with daily opportunities to witness the kind of healing and compassion that Dr. Washington brought to his work, while also allowing him to contribute his own skills, primarily administrative and organizational abilities that had been developed during his business career, to expand the clinic's capacity to serve patients who had nowhere else to turn for medical care. Maya Washington, now 13 years old, and even more articulate and insightful than she had been during the airplane confrontation, had become a regular volunteer at the clinic during her summer breaks and holiday periods, working alongside her father and Bradford in a relationship that had evolved from adversarial to collaborative to genuinely affectionate. Her ability to maintain her faith in Bradford's capacity for redemption, even when his progress seemed slow or uncertain, had provided him with the kind of unconditional acceptance that had been missing from his life since childhood. "Mr. Wellington," Maya said during one of their afternoon conversations while organizing patient files, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't gotten sick and come to the hospital where Daddy works? Do you think you would have ever figured out that being mean to people because of their skin color was really just hurting yourself more than anyone else?" The directness of Maya's question, combined with her matter-of-fact reference to his previous racism as a form of self-harm, demonstrated the kind of moral clarity that had consistently challenged Bradford to examine his own behavior and motivations with greater honesty than he had ever brought to self-reflection. Her suggestion that his heart attack had been a necessary catalyst for personal growth, rather than simply a medical emergency, was both humbling and enlightening. Bradford considered her question carefully before responding, recognizing that Maya deserved the same intellectual honesty that she consistently brought to their conversations. "I think," he said slowly, "that I was so trapped by my own fear and anger that I probably would have kept making the same mistakes and hurting people until something forced me to stop. The heart attack wasn't just a wake-up call about my physical health. It was the only thing that could have broken through all the walls I had built to protect myself from having to admit that I was wrong about people, wrong about what mattered in life, and wrong about who I wanted to be." Maya smiled with satisfaction at his response, recognizing that Bradford had achieved the kind of self-awareness and accountability that marked genuine personal growth rather than superficial behavior modification. "I'm glad you got sick, then," she said with characteristic directness, "because even though it was scary and painful, It helped you become someone that your children can be proud of, instead of someone they have to make excuses for. The reference to his children touched on one of the most painful aspects of Bradford's transformation: the recognition that his racist behavior had not only damaged his own life, but had also created lasting trauma and embarrassment for his son and daughter, who had been forced to explain and defend their father's actions to friends, teachers, and classmates who had seen the viral footage of his airplane breakdown. His relationship with his children had been slowly healing as they witnessed his genuine efforts to change and grow, but the process had required him to acknowledge the full extent of the harm his behavior had caused to people he claimed to love. Dr. Washington's observation of Bradford's gradual transformation had been marked by professional curiosity, as well as personal satisfaction, as he had witnessed the kind of fundamental character change that demonstrated both the possibility of human redemption and the powerful connection between emotional healing and physical health. Bradford's cardiac condition had improved dramatically as his stress levels decreased, his social connections expanded, and his sense of purpose shifted from self-serving to service-oriented goals. Bradford Dr. Washington said during one of their regular medical checkups, "Your latest cardiac tests show improvement that goes beyond what we typically see from medication and lifestyle changes alone. Your heart is healing in ways that suggest your emotional and spiritual recovery has been just as important as your physical rehabilitation." The acknowledgement from Dr. Washington that Bradford's transformation had been authentic and meaningful rather than performative or temporary was deeply significant, representing recognition from the man he had most grievously wronged that his efforts at redemption had achieved something genuine and valuable. The relationship between the two men had evolved from doctor-patient to something approaching friendship built on mutual respect for each other's humanity and shared commitment to the healing work that the clinic provided to their community. The one-year anniversary of Bradford's heart attack had been marked by a celebration at the clinic that brought together patients, staff, volunteers, and community supporters to recognize the expansion of services that had been made possible by donations grants and the kind of dedicated volunteer work that Bradford had come to exemplify. His transformation from the clinic's most reluctant volunteer to one of its most committed advocates had become an inspiring example of how people could change if they were willing to confront their own shortcomings and commit to doing better. Patricia Wellington's gradual reconciliation with her former husband had been one of the most surprising developments of Bradford's recovery period, as she had witnessed his genuine transformation and begun to consider the possibility that the man she had fallen in love with decades earlier might still exist beneath the layers of entitlement and prejudice that had accumulated over years of unchecked privilege and social isolation. Their relationship remained tentative and carefully bounded, but it held the promise of eventual healing if Bradford continued to demonstrate through his actions that his change was permanent rather than temporary. "I'm not ready to remarry you," Patricia had told him during one of their conversations about their future, "but I'm willing to consider the possibility that you've become someone I could respect and trust again. The children need to see that people can change and grow from their mistakes, and if your transformation is genuine, then maybe there's hope for our family to heal from the damage that your behavior caused." The airline industry conference, where Bradford had been invited to speak about the importance of diversity training and bias prevention, had represented a full-circle moment that neither he nor Dr. Washington could have imagined 18 months earlier. Standing before an audience of airline executives, crew members, and passenger service representatives, Bradford had shared his story with the kind of honest vulnerability that demonstrated both his understanding of the harm his behavior had caused and his commitment to preventing others from making similar mistakes. "I stood in that airplane aisle 18 months ago, convinced that I was entitled to comfort at the expense of someone else's dignity," Bradford had told the conference audience, "and I nearly died from the stress and isolation that my hatred created in my own life. The man I tried to humiliate saved my life. His daughter taught me about forgiveness, and the community I tried to exclude welcomed me when I had nowhere else to turn. I'm here today not to excuse my behavior or ask for sympathy, but to demonstrate that people can change if they're willing to do the difficult work of examining their own hearts and choosing service over selfishness. Captain David Thompson, who had attended the conference and listened to Bradford's presentation, approached him afterward with the kind of respectful acknowledgement that marked genuine recognition of personal growth and moral courage. "Mr. Wellington," he said, "I want you to know that your willingness to take responsibility for your actions and work toward redemption has restored my faith in the possibility that people can choose to become better than their worst moments. The airline industry is stronger because of the example you've set for how to respond to personal failure with accountability and growth. The moment when Bradford and Dr. Washington boarded a flight together, the same route from JFK to London that had been the site of their original confrontation, represented more than just a symbolic gesture of reconciliation. It demonstrated the kind of authentic relationship that could develop between people who had moved beyond their initial conflict to discover shared values, mutual respect, and common commitment to making the world a more just and compassionate place. Maya, now preparing to begin high school with plans to pursue pre-med studies that would eventually allow her to follow in her father's footsteps, as a healer watched the two men settle into their adjacent seats with the satisfaction of someone whose faith in human redemption had been vindicated by patient hope and persistent love. Her presence on the flight served as a reminder of the wisdom and moral clarity that had helped transform a moment of ugly confrontation into an opportunity for genuine healing and growth. The follow-up cardiac surgery that Dr. Elijah Washington performed on Bradford Wellington 2 years after their initial encounter represented far more than routine medical care. It had become a profound symbol of the healing power of forgiveness, the possibility of redemption through genuine transformation, and the way that grace could flow between people who had moved beyond their initial conflicts to discover shared humanity and common purpose. The procedure itself was less complex than the emergency operation that had saved Bradford's life, but it carried deeper emotional significance as both men reflected on the journey that had brought them from airplane confrontation to surgical suite partnership. Maya Washington, now 14 years old, and demonstrating the kind of intellectual brilliance and moral clarity that had marked her childhood, had requested permission to observe the surgery as part of her preparation for eventual medical school admission. Her presence in the operating room served as a reminder of the wisdom and compassion that had helped transform a moment of ugly racism into an opportunity for genuine healing and growth, and her questions about surgical technique and patient care demonstrated the kind of dedicated curiosity that promised future excellence in whatever field she ultimately chose to pursue. "Dr. Washington," Maya said, as she watched her father make the precise incisions required to access Bradford's cardiac tissue, "is it strange to be performing surgery on someone who used to hate you because of your race? Do you ever think about what he said on the airplane when you're trying to save his life?" The directness of Maya's question reflected her continuing commitment to understanding the complex relationships between justice and mercy, accountability and forgiveness, consequences and redemption that had characterized their family discussions throughout Bradford's transformation period. Her ability to acknowledge the painful history, while also recognizing the possibility of genuine change, had been instrumental in creating the conditions that allowed healing to occur for everyone involved in the original confrontation. Dr. Washington considered his daughter's question carefully as he continued the delicate work of repairing Bradford's cardiac tissue, recognizing that his response would shape not only Maya's understanding of forgiveness, but also her approach to the healing profession that she hoped to enter. "I think about how much pain and fear someone must be carrying to express such hatred toward people they've never met," he replied, his voice steady despite the complexity of the surgical procedure. "And I'm grateful that Mr. Wellington found the courage to confront his own pain rather than continuing to spread it to others." The surgery proceeded flawlessly, with Bradford's heart responding positively to the repairs and adjustments that would ensure continued healthy function for years to come. But the most significant healing had already occurred in the relationships between the people involved. Bradford's transformation from racist to dedicated community servant, Maya's development from wise child to mature young woman, and Dr. Washington's evolution from victim of discrimination to agent of reconciliation and hope. Bradford's recovery from the follow-up surgery was remarkably smooth, aided by his improved physical condition, his strong support network at the clinic, and his genuine motivation to maintain the health that would allow him to continue the service work that had become the central purpose of his new life. His conversations with Dr. Washington during the recovery period reflected the kind of authentic friendship that had developed between two men who had discovered shared values and mutual respect, despite their dramatically different backgrounds and initial conflict. Elijah Bradford said during one of their post-surgical consultations using Dr. Washington's first name with the easy familiarity that marked their evolved relationship, "I need you to know that saving my life wasn't the most important thing you did for me. Teaching me how to find meaning through service, showing me what genuine strength and dignity look like, and giving me the opportunity to become someone my children could be proud of. Those gifts were far more valuable than the cardiac surgery." Dr. Washington accepted Bradford's gratitude with the same grace that had characterized his response to the original racist attack, recognizing that both men had been changed by their journey from conflict to collaboration. "Bradford," he replied, "you did the difficult work of examining your own heart and choosing to change. I just provided some medical support along the way. The real healing happened because you were willing to acknowledge the pain you had caused and commit to doing better." The expansion of the free medical clinic into a comprehensive community health center had been made possible by donations from Bradford's former business associates who had been inspired by his transformation to contribute to the kind of service work that addressed health disparities in underserved communities. The facility now provided not only cardiac care, but also pediatric services, mental health counseling, and health education programs that reached thousands of patients who might otherwise have gone without medical attention. Maya's summer internship at the expanded health center had provided her with hands-on experience in patient care, medical research, and community health advocacy that would serve as valuable preparation for her future medical career. Her work with patients from diverse backgrounds had reinforced her understanding of medicine as a calling to serve rather than merely a profession to practice, and her interactions with Bradford had demonstrated the possibility that even the most damaged relationships could be healed through genuine commitment to growth and change. The scholarship fund that Bradford had established for students from underserved communities who wanted to pursue medical careers had already supported 12 young people in their educational journeys, with several recipients expressing particular interest in cardiac surgery and community health work. The fund represented Bradford's recognition that his previous wealth and privilege had been wasted on selfish pursuits, and his commitment to using whatever resources remained available to him for purposes that would benefit others, rather than merely serving his own comfort and status. Patricia Wellington's decision to remarry Bradford after witnessing 3 years of consistent transformation and dedicated service had been carefully considered and gradually implemented, reflecting her recognition that people could indeed change if they were willing to do the difficult internal work that genuine growth required. Their renewed relationship was built on foundations of mutual respect, shared values, and commitment to raising their children with the kind of moral clarity and compassionate wisdom that Maya Washington had consistently demonstrated throughout the family's healing process. The airline industry's adoption of Bradford's story as a central component of diversity training and bias prevention programs had resulted in measurable improvements in passenger experiences and crew responses to discriminatory behavior, demonstrating the positive impact that individual transformation could have on institutional practices and cultural norms. Bradford's willingness to share his story publicly, despite the personal embarrassment it entailed, had created educational opportunities that helped prevent other people from making similar mistakes and causing similar harm. Captain David Thompson's promotion to the airline's Vice President of Safety and Inclusion had been motivated partly by his principled handling of the original airplane confrontation and his leadership in developing new protocols for addressing discriminatory passenger behavior, had earned recognition throughout the aviation industry. His friendship with both Bradford and Dr. Washington had become a symbol of the kind of moral courage that institutional leaders could demonstrate when they prioritized human dignity over customer convenience or corporate profit. The final scene of redemption and healing occurred exactly 3 years after the original airplane confrontation, when Bradford Drive. Washington and Maya boarded a flight together as friends and colleagues rather than adversaries, sitting side by side in seats that represented not just physical proximity, but genuine partnership in the work of healing and service. The contrast between Bradford's racist demands for segregation and his current comfort with integration demonstrated the kind of fundamental character change that many people doubted was possible, but that had been achieved through sustained commitment to growth, accountability, and genuine repentance. Maya's observation as they settled into their seats captured the essential truth about human transformation and the possibility of redemption, even in the most damaged relationships. "You know," she said with characteristic insight, "Daddy always taught me that broken hearts could heal stronger than they were before, but I never realized that applied to broken people too." Mr. Wellington's heart isn't just healthier now. His whole life is healthier because he learned how to love instead of hate. The wisdom embedded in Maya's words, the recognition that healing could strengthen rather than merely restore that redemption, could create something better than what had existed before the damage occurred, and that love was ultimately more powerful than hatred in shaping human destiny, provided the perfect conclusion to a story that had begun with ugliness and conflict, but had been transformed through grace, courage, and persistent hope into something beautiful and inspiring. As their flight departed for London, where Dr. Washington would present his latest research on pediatric cardiac surgery, and Bradford would share his transformation story with medical professionals working to address health disparities in underserved communities. The 3 passengers represented living proof that people could choose to become better than their worst moments, that forgiveness could coexist with accountability, and that even the most damaged relationships could be healed through genuine commitment to growth, service, and love. The final frames of their story showed not perfect people who had never made mistakes, but redeemed people who had learned from their failures, grown through their struggles, and discovered that the most meaningful victories in life came not from defeating others, but from overcoming the worst parts of themselves. Maya's continued faith in human redemption. Dr. Washington's commitment to healing in all its forms, and Bradford's transformation from hatred to love, had created a narrative that offered hope for anyone willing to do the difficult work of examining their own hearts and choosing to become agents of healing rather than sources of harm in the world. Bradford's journey from racist airline passenger to dedicated community servant had taken 3 years of sustained effort, countless moments of difficult self-examination, and the patient support of people who had every reason to reject him, but who chose instead to model the kind of grace and forgiveness that makes genuine transformation possible. His story served as evidence that redemption was available to anyone willing to acknowledge their failures, accept responsibility for their actions, and commit to the long-term work of becoming better than they had been. Dr. Washington's response to Bradford's racist attack had demonstrated the kind of moral leadership that transforms victims into healers, conflicts into opportunities for growth, and individual pain into collective healing. His refusal to respond to hatred with hatred, his commitment to extending medical care even to those who had wronged him, and his patience with Bradford's gradual transformation had created the conditions that made redemption possible for everyone involved in their story. Maya Washington's role as the moral compass, who had guided both men toward better choices and deeper understanding, had illustrated the power of childlike wisdom to cut through adult complexity and identify the essential truth in any situation. Her consistent faith in human goodness, her refusal to accept racist behavior as normal or inevitable, and her compassionate concern even for those who had caused her pain, had provided the foundation upon which healing and reconciliation could be built. Their collective journey from airplane confrontation to genuine friendship had become a powerful testimony to the possibility that love could indeed overcome hatred, that grace could triumph over prejudice, and that even the most damaged relationships could be restored through genuine commitment to growth, accountability, and service to others. The story of Flight 847 had begun with one man's racist refusal to share space with a black doctor and his daughter, but it had become a testament to the transformative power of forgiveness, the possibility of redemption, and the ultimate triumph of human dignity over human cruelty. If this story of transformation, redemption, and the power of love to overcome hatred has moved you, please like and subscribe our channel for more stories that celebrate the possibility of positive change in our world. Share your own experiences of forgiveness, growth, and second chances in the comments below. We read every message and are constantly inspired by the wisdom and courage of our community. Remember that every person you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about, and sometimes a moment of grace or compassion can change not just their day, but their entire life trajectory. Together we can build a world where dignity, respect, and love are stronger than prejudice, hatred, and fear.